I invite you to imagine, what if? It was the Soviets, and not the United States of America, that managed to reach the moon first. It is a question that is certainly enticing, and it is exactly the what if that underpins the TV show For All Mankind. For All Mankind is an Apple TV Plus show that first premiered all the way back in 2019, and as of recording of this video, is still set to debut new episodes. It was one of the first ever TV shows to be offered by Apple TV Plus, and thus is one of the platform's longest running. As of recording of this video, the year of 2024, the show already has 4 seasons under its belt, and from the title of this video, you can already suspect the general direction of the video. That yes, I do perceive the show as having entered a decline. As any piece of media goes on, it is not uncommon for it to have a decline. It is only natural for some of the initial spark to die down. TV shows like these are a dime a dozen. Yet this show in particular comes with its own unique challenges that are now, I believe, causing it to lose its momentum. And I am not speaking of this to imply that the show is some unwatchable train wreck. For All Mankind, even if facing somewhat of a decline, is still a perfectly fine show, better than a lot of content currently available. But envisioning a future, a different kind of future, within a scenario of a what if, is not an easy task. It is indeed an ambitious undertaking that, at least at first, the show dealt with well. But with the show's progression, there are some underlying issues and problems that are becoming more and more apparent. It is becoming more and more obvious that the show is being crushed by its own ambitious premise. As to why or how exactly that even is the case, we shall start at the very genesis of the show. We shall start at the point where our timeline branches out and becomes For All Mankind. For All Mankind sets itself on a different path from us by placing the Soviets on the moon first, a reverse of what actually transpired. The first episode quite effectively displays the immediate effects of such a diversion within a timeline. We see people gather, our main characters observing this moment in history.
Is this really happening?
A thought vocalized, and a thought that most likely visits those who decide to embark on this show. An event that was supposed to end the race towards the moon is no longer in place, and therefore the timeline shall be changed forever. Something that we now recognize as the finish line of the space race, For All Mankind thus sees as a catalyst that propels its narrative forward. Our focal point within the narrative, within the story, is the perspectives of the Americans and their space agency, also known as NASA. These opening shots, this entire scene that sets the stage for the show, is quite obviously monumental. It is within these opening scenes that we are supposed to be hooked onto a particular story. It is supposed to provide a promise, and incentive us to why you should stick around. So what sort of promises does the opening scenes make towards its audience? The catalyst of the story is, as discussed, the reversal of a real-life historic event, the landing on the moon. This catalyst implies that the race for the space and exploration is indeed not over, and that this further fuels a rivalry between the two countries. The story progression forwards is quite clear. We are about to witness a science fiction story of space exploration, along the way intertwined with the more grounded politics between nations on Earth. This is the engine that ultimately fuels the narrative of For All Mankind, which leads us to... Season 1 adheres the best to these promises, which comes as no surprise. After all, Season 1 is what ultimately sets up the way this entire show operates, and because of that, it is also the best season. It focuses on the acceleration of the space race. Since it is a race, it has more than one side, yet we are mostly concentrated on the works of the United States. Out of the defeat over the moon, the United States become motivated to land on the moon themselves, and we get to see exactly the twists and turns of their efforts. We are also introduced to a slew of characters. First, we have a more practical side of space exploration. There is the Baldwin family, Edwin Baldwin, who is an astronaut in NASA, his wife Karen Baldwin, who is a stay-at-home wife and mother, and their son Shane. Then we have the Stevens family. There is Gordo Stevens, a buddy of Ed and an astronaut. There is also his wife Tracy. She is the wife of Gordo, but later on herself becomes an astronaut. They have 2 children, Jimmy and Danny. We also have other female astronauts, Molly Cobb, Ellen Wilson, and Daniel Poole. Second, we have the science side of space exploration. The most notable characters are firstly Margo Madison. She works within the mission control and is working her way up the ranks. Alongside her storyline, we also have Alida Rosales, a young girl who comes from Mexico and immigrates into the United States with her father. Of course, along the way there are many more characters within the fabric of the show's narrative, but this cast of characters prove to be the major players within the larger overarching story. From a purely pragmatic perspective, the characters introduced bring a lot of potential basis for storytelling that the show might need, which is only to the benefit of the show. The general direction that the season is going towards is that of establishing a base on the moon. That makes sense, works great, all good and fine. There are a few things that work wonderfully in the season's favor. First, it feels as though it has actual weight, and by that I mean that the season quite nicely displays that which the humanity is stepping into, that is the further exploration of space, and that it is a laborious process and also a risky one. When things go wrong, and they do many times, it actually feels as though they truly matter. There is also another thing that aids the show, that is its connection to real history. It thrives off of the fact that this timeline is still in its infancy in terms of diversion from the real world. It has way more material to work with in regards to history. For instance, the inclusion of Werner von Braun is honestly great. It provides drama to the plot quite easily since the show can work with real history. I suppose the greatest compliment that I could afford this season is that all the things feel as though they are there to serve a purpose. We get to see a lot of characters introduced, but they don't feel as though they are there just for needless padding. Each character brings something to the table, with the show managing to actually combine their individual journeys with the main overarching thread of the plot. We shall delve into some other aspects of this particular season in different parts of this video. But for now, let us move on to Season 2. And I believe that sadly, this is the season where the cracks begin to show. Season 2 really does break away from what Season 1 is, but not in a particularly good way. It is in this season that we see a particular quirk of the show that would continue to be part of the show's core structure. What the season does is that it jumps forward in time, around a decade or so. It does make sense for the narrative to skip around certain parts. It would be boring if we just saw every detail of every year in grueling detail, considering that this is a science fiction show focused on space exploration, and meaningful progress really doesn't come that fast. Therefore, I think it is ultimately for the benefit of the show to move forward in such a way. There is another quirk that appears and will continue to appear, that is exposition being thrown out all over the place. They have to fill in the gaps between the seasons, but they cannot literally show what happens during them, so of course they opt to tell that information. For this particular season, I believe they handle it decently. After all, this is only the first time jump ahead, therefore there are only so many divergences to catch up on, and also there are only so many developments within the lives of characters. Due to this, the first few episodes can feel a bit too tame. They're there to catch us up and to settle us into a new status quo. I cannot say this is a feature. It certainly is more of a flaw, but it is a flaw that is inherent in the way the show tells its story, and a flaw that the show chooses to take consciously to try and gain a bigger benefit, that is advancing forwards without meandering too much. Yet, there is a fundamental mistake that the show makes. I believe it focuses a tad too much on the characters that it establishes in Season 1. In a way, it does make complete sense to do so. We ultimately do need characters that we should follow within a story. But what we end up with is a show that feels this weird obligation to suddenly show all of the characters and what they are up to. This wouldn't be too bad per se. Again, seems like a reasonable thing to do, but you cannot really keep inventing probable reasons for absolutely all characters to be directly connected to the main thread of space exploration absolutely all the time. Therefore, some character arcs just come as needless padding. One of the primary examples of this is Molly. Molly is a cool character, it is lovely to have her, but sad to say it, in the grander scheme of the plot, her storyline isn't particularly relevant. Not to say that it is a worthless storyline. However, it doesn't necessarily push the show forward in its trajectory. So the season begins, and episode 1 focuses on a solar event. Since the US has a base on the moon and the team over there are in the middle of a mission, this obviously brings some problems and some drama. Nothing inherently bad in that. I think it is good to show that space can cause real problems and real issues for people who dare to explore it. Adversity is fine. What happens is that Molly is out there on the moon and she takes cover inside a cave on the moon. But then she sees her colleague out there being exposed to the solar flare, which carries lethal amounts of radiation. Molly does something that the show plays off as heroic. She goes out there to rescue him while the solar flare is blasting full force. Of course, it is a heroic action at its core. The show then shows the effects of that, as some health issues pop up for Molly and she begins going blind. The storyline itself thus begins to exist in a relative isolation. It is a personal story rather than a collective one. It is not as egregious in a sense that at least it focuses on what type of things people could experience as a result of such explorations, but it does indicate a slight change in which stories the show chooses to follow, and there are way more egregious examples of this. Season 2 sees the introduction of Kelly, the adopted daughter of Edward and Karen Baldwins. She kinda comes out of nowhere at the beginning of the season since she got adopted during the time jump, but we do get some details to ground her character. For some reason, we get to see her journey of discovery. She goes on to find her biological father, visit his restaurant, and find out all sorts of details about him. But again, I cannot possibly see why the show detours in this direction. Similarly, we get to see the show focus on characters like Karen and Danny, the son of Gordo and Tracy Stevens. Karen, after what happened to her in season 1, suddenly becomes a businesswoman who owns a bar, which I guess is good for her. But then Danny begins working with her. Now, to add some context, Danny is the son of her friend Tracy. Danny was also best friends with her deceased son Shane. Karen also used to watch Danny all the time because his mom and dad were busy being astronauts. So they decide to make Danny and Karen sleep together. And why do they do that? I do not know. It is not like it serves any particular purpose or the show uses it to say something grander. At least, not about Danny. You can argue that there is still some utility in the storyline for Karen, but let's table that for later. But it is generally just there as additional padding and drama. The most egregious example for me personally is the way they focus on that one dude who trains under Ed Baldwin. During this season, Ed works with selecting who goes on missions and training astronaut candidates, which is fine and cool. But the show, I think, spends too much screen time on this one guy who tries to suck up to Ed and seeks his approval really hard. It doesn't really add anything either. And this is egregious because remember season 1? There was a mission at the end where Ellen, Deke, and another guy went to space. That random dude was brought out of nowhere, and the guy literally got incinerated up in space. The show barely paid attention to a person who literally got killed up in space. He was quite literally a casualty of human exploration in space, yet we barely got to learn anything about the man. And here you have the show focus on this guy who doesn't even really do anything. The character doesn't even show up in the next season either. His main characteristic is that he's ginger and Ed hates him. That's all. And these examples are symptomatic of one of the main differences in trajectory between seasons 1 and 2. The main mistake that is being made with these storylines is that they feel like they exist to fill in the time while we are away from the storyline that was established in season 1. What I appreciate in season 1 is that everything worked together harmoniously and in tandem towards one storyline that culminated in the finale. Here, however, the show begins to offshoot from the main trajectory. In pure narrative terms, this is definitely a change, and not always for the better. It is objectively a different approach from season 1. What I thought was a nice little touch was that even Molly was built up as an astronaut, and that was good. But in season 1, she was literally absent for some time before reappearing again right at the finale, because the show didn't feel the need to meander. It kept its eyes on the trajectory. It brought her out when she was needed and relevant. These principles within the narrative are clearly being followed no longer by the time of season 2. These inclusions can be okay. They are not a complete end of the world, but this is where the show does betray what it sets up in the first season a bit. You might say that it already did that it already began straying away with the Karen storyline in season 1, that it was relatively isolated too. Well, it was. Until it wasn't. It had very real consequences for the overarching plot, but it is undeniable that the thesis behind the show changes. I think it is quite obvious what the thesis back in season 1 was. The development of the space program, which was also inclusive of characters and their personal journeys, which ultimately still served the main plot. The truth is that the show finds itself in an interesting place, to focus either on the larger story at play, or to focus on the smaller journeys within the larger story. But to what extent? It is not unlike those two cannot coexist. Season 1 in this sense was quite good. Both these directions existed together, yet the main approach behind the show is altered from here forwards, with the personal journeys beginning to gain more space while not necessarily being attached to the development of the space program. As to how one could view this change, it really does depend. Some of these storylines are not necessary and bring in relatively low value. Some, however, I wouldn't be too quick to condemn just yet. Under a different light, things can gain a new meaning. The only reason why I'm calling it a mistake is that the show here forwards doesn't always use this change in its thesis to its advantage. But it isn't to say that there is no argument that is being conveyed through them. So, the show alters its approach a bit. And what about it? And this now might be a hot take, but I think that the time jumps are slightly counterproductive to what they are trying to accomplish. If you want to be more character-focused, it's okay, but at a certain point, it does become a bit funny when you are supposed to be attached to these characters, yet miss out on years of character development. It also begins being equally as funny that every character has big drama hitting them around the same time roughly every 10 years like clockwork. What I feel the show could have done was more of an anthological approach.
They are already jumping ahead and ahead. They are already in there always reintroducing characters. I think it would have been okay for the show to not be as precious with its characters. Storylines of Kelly, Danny, or Karen, while not having a direct payoff in regards to the main overarching plot within the season, do come into play later. While under normal circumstances, you would applaud a show for doing the legwork and trying to build some character, the question is whether that character building was even of quality here and was it absolutely necessary for us to be here. So we use the time jumps to skip around the boring parts, yet we still end up with some boring parts. Let's also think back on season 1. We had an entire roster of characters who we didn't need to get extended storylines for to build their lore. They were thrown into a scenario and we saw them operate in that scenario, and that was the extent of it. It used characters when it needed them, and their storylines didn't extend beyond the scope of the program. There is a question that I think is quite important to ask, especially in the context of the show. Why are we focusing on this character and not another? In a premise like this, I feel like while individual importance within the plot is nice to highlight, it would be also equally as nice to highlight the scale of the effort by focusing on characters that actually contribute to humanity's journey into space. For any Danny and Karen storyline, I cannot help but feel like there might have been an astronaut or a NASA scientist who had way more relevant of a story to be told. I think that it could have been perfectly fine if the show didn't focus as much on Karen, Kelly, or Danny during the second season, and just brought them into prominence in season 3. This isn't The Crown. We are not building a dynastic story tethered to a couple of most important characters here. We do not need these storylines. At least we shouldn't be needing them. You will notice that this issue will continue to crop up in the show in certain ways from here forwards. We also get the general stupidity for the sake of plot. There is the matter of Ed. Now that he has a more managerial role at NASA, he is for some reason allowed to assign his own lackeys into space missions without any overboard. He just assigns people and nobody outside of Ed does any due diligence whether the candidate is right. One of the people that he assigns to a mission on the moon is his good old pal Gordo. Gordo himself is an astronaut, yes, but he has been going through it a bit in the second season. He and his astronaut wife Tracy got divorced and he became a bit of a mess, and also an alcoholic. But that doesn't stop Ed from assigning Gordo to a mission. The director of NASA comes into Ed's office and rightfully points out just how unfit Gordo is for the mission.
Have you taken a good look at him lately? The man's a train wreck waiting to happen. Let's hope you're making all these decisions for the right reasons, Ed. Not out of nepotism or favoritism, or whatever kind of ism this is.
Yet no more opposition comes from that. Now, this is in line with the characterization of Ed that we had way back in season 1. He is the type of a person who thinks that throwing people stuff to do solves their problems. I thought season 1 had a very correct idea with Gordo because he actually goes to a therapist to try and resolve his issues. But season 2 does away with all of that and just puts Gordo on a mission. And that somehow solves all of his issues? The thing is that, first of all, this is extremely unprofessional. We are talking about something quite serious. This is a mission in space. This is not just some stroll down the park. You have to assume that a lot of manpower went into creating this mission, preparing for this mission. There are also a lot more people involved, not to mention the fact that a lot of funds have been poured into it, most definitely. So to send an astronaut who is clearly suffering with alcohol consumption issues as a way of therapy is really insane. Yet what I dislike in the chain of events even more is that the wrongness of the choice is not addressed further than that, because Gordo does go up there, and he actually saves the day by sacrificing himself along with Tracy. While the sacrifice is of course heroic, there is still that undercurrent, and you cannot really draw a direct line between Gordo going up there and them sacrificing themselves per se, but I do think that there should have been some bigger repercussions for Ed. This is still a mistake despite the fact that Gordo managed to save the day before doing anything bad due to his mental state. It just isn't really the conclusion that should have been, since it kind of erases Gordo's issues altogether and gives them no real closure. I suppose they were going for a more dramatic approach, to display a man in crisis who manages to get himself back on his feet through working on himself for this bigger purpose. I am not denying the dramatic worth in that, but it is really unfortunate that it comes at the cost of dumbing down NASA as an organization. And what we are discussing here, it has a name. Nuance. These are the layers that I think that the show should have discussed, but didn't. The show didn't really consider these nuances, and you will, once again, notice that this is quite a pattern within the show. We will keep returning to it. It will keep cropping up, and these are the primary things that give me pause while watching the second season. They keep taking me out of the story and breaking immersion. The thoughts presented so far ranged from neutral to negative, but it would be a disservice to say that the season didn't have a lot of things going for it. Science fiction is a genre of speculation. and some of the speculations presented I actually really enjoyed. For instance, the storyline given this time around to Tracy I felt was interesting. It riffs off of the last season quite nicely in a sense that it relates to the overall perception of the space race. Last season, she and her husband were regarded as the space couple. This season, she transitions from an astronaut to a more of a TV personality. It isn't necessarily directly related to advancing space travel, but I think it is a really nice touch. You can see the rationale for its existence. Space travel become commonplace and naturally captured the imagination of audiences. Within the larger picture of the show, this type of inclusion somewhat normalizes the whole affair, makes it more accessible. Again, it makes sense, great to see, just what I signed up for. I think that there was a slightly missed opportunity here though, because you have to consider this from the perspective of propaganda. I feel like the show could have emphasized the fact that it was a form of propaganda more.
However, you can view Tracy's storyline as yet another casualty of this new approach. What is interesting is that the mission becomes televised not because of NASA's active pushing for it. It is actually a proposition that Tracy herself brings to Ed at the start of the season. It is a great progression from the last season, considering that women were brought on to be astronauts largely because the USA needed to somehow respond to the USSR and them bringing a woman onto the moon. While this viewpoint is rather cynical, you have to consider that the push for women in the program wasn't because someone decided to be progressive for the sake of being progressive. What you can see from Tracy's initial scenes is that she's using her fame as a female astronaut in her favor. We see her do a commercial dressed in an astronaut suit. We see her do talk shows. She's essentially leveraging her own position through her own animus rather than that of NASA. She was given the power, so she's using it. A huge opportunity that was missed here was that she could have greatly contributed to the program through her status. A major theme this season that you can sense is the overarching conflict between the US and the USSR is really a show-off of perceptions rather than a direct combat conflict. We witness the US fighting the USSR through many means, and not many of them direct. Propaganda should be one of them. It is in this situation that Tracy would hold a lot of sway. It would be a flip dynamic of power from season 1. If a situation arose where they needed a more active weapon in propaganda warfare, Tracy would be the perfect fit. A lot of things within the show are already done for appearances rather than human progress. Just have Tracy factor into it in a more overt way. What we get instead is something that is less exciting. Tracy's storyline chooses to look inwards rather than outwards. They focus on her being newly engaged and trying to coexist with her ex-husband Gordo. Whenever we see her on screen, a lot of the scenes actually focus on her relationship with Gordo. What is also fascinating about the storyline is that you can see exactly how the seasons 1 and 2 differ through Tracy. The first season also had a partial focus on her marriage and home life, yet what is notable is that whatever we witnessed of her relationship was shaped by either the space program or by societal norms at large, both of which the show tried to actively tackle. It is also important to note that the show establishes the social norms as being shaped by the program to an extent. What happens in season 2 is the opposite. We see character relationship drama shaping the program instead, as the show chooses to prioritize that. In one of the scenes including Tracy, we see her barge into Ed's office in order to ask him to remove Gordo from a mission.
Just bounce him off the flight. He has been a washed-up has-been for the last 10 years. It will not kill him if he doesn't go on for 2 more months.
She cites reasons for her request being that he would ruin the public perception of her, which is not an unfair argument. What is interesting is that first, as we already discussed, Gordo should not have been put on the moon in the first place. As per Thomas Paine, everyone knows he's an alcoholic, so why would NASA give him a pass? Nonsense. At least put him in a program to become sober first. And second, her request is not really satisfied. She still ends up on the moon with Gordo, and nothing that she says would happen really happens. We don't really get to see her reputation be tarnished at all, so either Tracy's overreacting or the show forgot. Both options make this little interaction seem like it was not born out of what the mission necessitated to advance the program, and thus causing a further effect, but rather character drama taking precedent, having no real effect on the program anyways, rendering the space race as a backdrop for it in the process. If their relationship was more integrated into the space exploration narrative, it would be okay, but it simply is not to the extent that it should have been. Same thing can be said about Tracy in isolation. Her storyline is not really focused on her newfound position or career, but rather on her relationship with her ex. While sure, it is their relationship that ultimately saves the day, it was born out of a lot of missed opportunities and a contrivance in the plot that was put there for the sake of this drama. It also makes Ed look really stupid in retrospect. What type of a leader is he if he knowingly puts 2 exes together in isolation? He was the person who saw both of them individually come to him with either sadness or anger over their marital status, and he made a judgment call that this was an okay dynamic and he went ahead with his decisions anyway. You can certainly argue that there are sexist undertones here, here. In this situation, Tracy was arguably a way more valuable candidate, and Gordo's candidacy was primarily held up by the power of friendship. It is a very reckless decision to create a dynamic where two people could have externalized their conflicts and created potential problems for the mission. Did it happen? No, it did not. But only because it didn't happen does not make Ed's choices correct. And this is yet another piece of proof that the show prioritized the excitement of these two being in the same vicinity for some perceived value of these characters and their relationship. The unfortunate side effect of this reversal of priorities is that the show begins bending reality to make it happen. It is best to view the environment of NASA as a set of rules that the writers abide by while writing the show. Those rules are the limits for the character writing that the show has to navigate in order to make itself work. A situation like this is probably what makes for the most compelling fiction. The way certain works find creative ways out of the frameworks that they find themselves in. I cannot attest as to exactly how much those rules are bent at any given moment for certain, but Season 2 bends those rules in very abrasive ways, and you don't need to be an expert to notice them. You also have to admit that it is a lazy way out. The show beginning to bend these rules to however they please to make the plot happen. That is just simply lazy. So while the execution of Tracy's storyline is less than stellar, the idea itself and the direction is great. The overall trajectory of the space exploration is also great. This season, riffing off of the last, focuses on the cohabitation of the moon between the United States and the Soviet Union. It raises the question of, okay, we are up there, so now what? The season builds up a joint mission of Apollo-Soyuz between the two countries, which is interesting enough. The last few episodes of the tensions rising between the two countries are great. There is one particular moment that sticks out to me the most. It is when the US astronauts see the USSR astronauts and they approach them with guns in their hands. The Soviets proceed to reach for something in their crate, and the Americans just begin firing at them. Then we get to reveal that the Soviets were just reaching for a card with some phrases in English, so that the Soviets could communicate with the Americans. A lot of drama ensues out of that, naturally, but I thought it was a great scenario to be explored. It's just the idea that some paranoid, trigger-happy person could bring about an entire crisis seems way too feasible. Which brings us to an interesting consideration. Why on earth did this season simply not focus more on that? More importantly, since the show already hops across years and decades, why not hop directly into more important and interesting bits? That is what they did back in Season 1. Yet in Season 2 we are suddenly preoccupied with what one of the astronauts' adoptive daughters is doing. Meanwhile, there are more interesting things happening over at NASA. Let's be real, the second season didn't really warrant a 10-episode season, not with the material we are presented. If you cut out the dumb decisions, needless characters, and unnecessary meandering, you would get a 5 or 6 episode tightly written TV show about space exploration. I think this season is such an interesting specimen. It is not quite far off from what preceded it, and it isn't as far away from history. I see this season as a bit of a transition. As we discussed, the show transforms its trajectory just a bit. It doesn't necessarily feel like the philosophy behind the show still focuses on where the humanity will end up. It begins to focus more so on where the characters themselves might end up. This is particularly funny when you realize that the show is called for all mankind. Season 1 efficiently displayed just how much of a collective journey it is. People perished in this journey, yet they did not linger too much on their demise. Characters were sad, but the show moved on, just as the entire journey would. It treated characters somewhat like cogs within this larger machine. I think that in a weird way, this is what I liked about Season 1. Because honestly, that is how it should be. It is such a fascinating conflict of philosophy within the premise of the show itself. To focus on a cast of characters exclusively for prolonged periods of time would be saying that it is they who deserve the most attention within humanity's journey further into space. Not focusing on some of them may also be disservice. Some of them have put in a lot of effort. It is a careful balance that the show has to maintain. But I wouldn't agree with the approach that it chooses from here on out at all. Within multiple scenes, we see the rooms of NASA be filled with multiple people, various experts in their fields. We also see the base on the moon, which has so many astronauts who are also just as much part of this journey. I sometimes cannot help but feel like we would be better off if we began following others. It is a very strange thing to be peeved about. I understand that. It is just that it is also this season that the show becomes too insular. It becomes too invested with the characters it already has. And this, I think, kinda goes against the overall message that Season 1 establishes. I also believe that, from this point of view, it hurts the show way more than it benefits it. As to how all of this pertains to anything moving forward, well, it seems as though that the show doubles down on its approach in full force.
Season 3 follows in the footsteps of Season 2 and jumps ahead another decade. This results in another few moments of acclamation and characters clunkily dropping in all the changes in characters' lives that happened during the gap. This season, though, in comparison to Season 2, does this with way less subtlety and elegance.
Remember, like yesterday, you coming to my office saying you had an idea. I thought you were gonna pitch me a new restaurant. You said I shouldn't ever want to get to enjoy space.
One of the first scenes in the season is a wedding that happens in space between Danny and his wife Amber, and because we skipped ahead, we once again get a whole lot of telling about just how amazing they are together, yet not a lot of showing.
I know you'll have an amazing life together. It's almost disgusting how perfect you are for each other.
When I first met Danny at our church, I knew he was the one for Amber. And the way he fits in so perfectly with her family and our congregation, it's like a fairy tale.
An unfortunate side effect of the time jumps, which again, I understand and I do think they are necessary, is that we consistently miss out on quite big chunks of character building. This season though, this is most obvious with Karen. Actually, I would dare to argue that a lot of her character developments actually only exist in those time jumps. In part, this makes sense. In the earlier seasons, she is quite removed from the main propelling force of the show, space exploration. She's a peripheral element in that regard. Season 2 ends with her selling her business and going to business school. Fast forward to Season 3, she's an established businesswoman who owns a hotel in space. This is all fine and great on the surface. Karen as a character had gone a long way after experiencing tremendous loss in Season 1, when she tragically lost her son. On paper, her story arc is incredible. Besides that one thing, Season 3 does indeed align with this new idea of Karen, that she is now this business-savvy person who can maneuver in these higher circles. We have scenes of her talking about her experiences, such as this.
I love taking risks, love negotiating. I love building things from the ground up.
It has been a while since Season 3 has come out, and I watched this show ever since its inception, week by week, and I will be completely frank, I was never truly convinced by this character arc of her as a businesswoman. My visceral reaction to it was simply to think that it feels like lip service. It simply doesn't feel like that is the case. If I want to understand my own visceral reaction to this character arc, I don't even need to look any further within the show. Karen's own character writing this season contains an example of how things should have been done, with her being a businesswoman. Because while her moments as this supposed entrepreneur do not hit as hard as the show would like, her moments as the wife of an astronaut work perfectly. There is a moment in episode 8 where Danny Stevens gets stuck underground on Mars after a landslide with Ed Baldwin. It is a dire situation that gets every space agency on their feet. Karen's first instinct is to do this.
I'm gonna stay behind, reach out to the families of those that are unaccounted for.
Henry Zinman can make those calls.
Not calls. We need to go to them personally and deliver the news and stay with them.
She herself goes to the wife of Danny Stevens in order to comfort her. This side of her works great, because it is a nice full circle moment from back in Season 1, when she was on the receiving end of support from other people during a crisis that involved her husband being up in space. The show didn't need to try to convince you that she was this well put together person who knew how to act in a crisis like this. Her actions simply displayed that. But Karen suddenly becoming this big personality in business doesn't really work as well, because we do not actually see her do much of anything in that regard before the season. The closest thing she did to acting like a savvy businesswoman on the show before this point was selling the bar that she owned back in Season 2.
$250.
No.
300 then.
450.
350.
400. With the trinkets in the case, it's worth at least that much, plus it's only gonna appreciate over time.
375.
390.
Sold.
And it is particularly funny considering that the exact same thing happens in the very first episode of Season 3. Dev invites her out into the desert to meet and offers her a big deal.
I'm truly sorry about Sam.
Thank you.
And you two built something amazing together. That's why I asked you here. Is it not enough?
No, it's very generous.
There is no real negotiation here, no maneuvering to reveal the character of Karen. There is just yet another businessman who hands her a deal and she runs with it. While there are scenes where Karen attempts to do some poaching and business-related endeavors, we really are supposed to run with this character mostly on exposition and hearsay. Other characters remark multiple times just how successful she is. But I will be honest, these praises just ring hollow. It is not unlike you cannot see this character moving in this direction. Karen is set up to be quite organized. She's displayed played as having some traits that certainly adhere to this progression, so it didn't come out of nowhere. But I want to refer back to what we discussed about Season 2. Season 2 already steered towards the direction of focusing on the characters themselves and prioritizing characters instead of the overarching plot. It made cognizant choices to stick with character arcs established in Season 1, even if they began to offshoot from the main story thread. But they skip out on a lot of character building with Karen due to these time jumps. So really, I would love for the show to decide on what they want to do. Are we building character, or are we building space exploration? Because the show seemingly tries to do both, but let me tell you, it sometimes fails. Again, I understand why they skip around. Really, they have to. It is really frustrating though that in Season 2, they chose to focus on Karen realizing she needs to change her life trajectory, but the show skips her actually enacting that change. It skips ahead to her already having dealt with all of that, and it loses a ton of storytelling potential. Part of Season 1, for instance, was the societal change incited through space exploration. Within this timeline, having a woman astronaut up in space was shown to make huge waves. The pre-existing and antiquated notions of that time of how a woman should operate permeated the plot. Karen was a prime example of a woman who was bound by these notions. Season 2 somewhat moved away from that already, with Karen owning a business. While it may display progress, I am sure that the progress wouldn't have been all-reaching and completely radical. It was already an interesting and puzzling choice to skip Karen moving from being this image of the perfect housewife to a business owner. Instead, they prefer to focus on her getting involved with her friend's son. So you can see how that screen time could have been better and more efficiently used. The transition of her character between Seasons 2 and 3 could have revealed so much. How she, as a woman, had to navigate the business world and establish her to the extent of being widely respected and recognized. Additionally, she could have been used to show just how space tourism developed. It is an interesting facet of the overall story, as well as Karen's arc, since it can reveal the general atmosphere surrounding space travel and how it developed. It is also stated that the company that Karen co-founded with Sam Cleveland was the first ever space tourism company. That is pretty huge for her character. The show largely skips this part, which is fair to an extent. It is not absolutely crucial to discuss it.
And remember back when discussing Season 2, I said that they could have stepped back from Karen since she was not directly related to the space side of plot. Well, the show made its bed and slept in it by including her still, and Season 3 makes her inclusion back in Season 2 even funnier. There is a very nice scene at the end of Season 1, where Karen expresses some thoughts about her own role within the situation.
Sure have a lot of rules, don't they?
Yes, they do. And you know what? They're all, excuse my language, they're... Actually, no, don't. Excuse my language, they're bullshit. The way we're supposed to dress and speak and think,
This comes after an entire season of her adhering to social norms as the wife of an astronaut, while also slowly seeing other women change around her. It is partly why her POV that season was relevant. It was a facet of the social aspect that the show tackles. What this scene reveals is that she experienced a character arc. She changed as a character. I also pointed out that while the storyline between Karen and Danny doesn't really say anything about Danny, it does serve the character of Karen. But the way it serves her character is, I would argue, useless from the get-go. What her encounter with Danny essentially is, in a nutshell, an expression of Karen being sick of her marriage. She has been fulfilling a certain role, and she acted out. The thing with this situation, though, is that it delivers exactly zero new information about her character. This was already done in Season 1. Did the second season escalate the situation? Yes, it did, but this could have been done during the time jump. Or not even at all. Again, this precious time could have been way better spent in building her up solely as a businesswoman who is trying to break away from that marriage and that role. At least they could actually build her character in that way instead of exposition. And I really want you to reflect on the second season. She faces absolutely zero adversity in regards to her business endeavors. Adversity is what builds and reveals character, and the second season has zero of that. You could literally skip the scenes with Karen and Danny in the second season and fast forward to Season 3, and barely anything would change. Instead, we have more evidence of her being a MILF than her being a businesswoman.
But you can see how it can be slightly funny when the show begins to focus more on characters, but not on the parts that would make them more interesting. This type of effect applies to other characters to varying degrees. Most of it is not as noticeable, but the stilt is definitely there. It is here that yet another pattern within the show emerges. Sometimes it lacks depth. It is either inability to see the depth or lack of imagination on the show's behalf, but it is here that the show starts to feel as though it is not speculating deep enough. Some elements are approached in a shallow and honestly unimaginative manner. If this isn't that clear for now, that is okay. We will be returning to this notion in various ways moving forward.
Returning to the plot, of course episode 1 has some crisis thrown in there. So now they have the space hotel, some debris hits it, and of course things go wrong. People die, kinda sorta a rinse and repeat of season 2 episode 1. At least this time around, the crisis leads to something more interesting. The whole fiasco with the hotel leads its owner Karen to join forces with Dev, a new character this season and a person who is also interested in space exploration. This season thus takes on quite an interesting direction. Beforehand, it was the Soviets versus the USA. It was a pretty straightforward conflict that drew from real history, but this season sees the private sector take a direct role in space exploration through Dev's company Helios. It adds a nice dynamic to the mix. It's honestly great on the conceptual level, and it does draw further parallels from real life, which makes it more digestible. What I do dislike is how it is ultimately used. There is a chain of events that happens in the first few episodes. Molly wants to assign Ed Baldwin as the head of the Mars mission for NASA. Margo, being the director of NASA, wants to assign Daniel Poole. Both of them have different arguments for that. Molly essentially argues that Ed is more experienced in the nitty-gritty, while Margo argues that Danielle has more theoretical knowledge about planets. This conflict is great. It represents both Molly and Margo great and where they stand. Granted, Molly does come off as slightly lesser since her position does seem more steeped in favoritism since she espoused with Ed, but I do think that both sides have sound reasoning. What happens is that Margo leaves town, and while she is away, Molly still ends up assigning Ed to head a Mars mission, and of course she goes on to deliver the great news to Ed. Margo returns, finds out, blows up, fires Molly, and meets with Ed. Margo then delivers the unfortunate news that Ed indeed won't be commanding Mars mission and assigns her own choice, Danielle, instead. So Mr. Baldwin meets up with Danielle and is straight up rude to her about the whole ordeal because his huge ego got bruised.
This, just having it taken away from, and for
what?
Danny, I know what you're capable of. I trained you, I've flown with you. I gave you your first command.
But?
Both know there are other factors at play here.
And well, this ultimately leads him to collude with Karen. And since she is now in cahoots with Helios, Ed still gets his big ticket in the race towards Mars as he is assigned to command the Mars mission for Helios. We get to see Margo and others react to these news as they are announced on TV. It is both amazing and disappointing. Amazing because you can see Margo's stubbornness, which is not entirely unjustified in this situation, blow up in everyone's faces. But disappointing because the show has a serious attitude problem. It keeps rewarding Ed Baldwin for, in my view, no real reason. I understand that within the narrative this man has done some great things, but the man first of all keeps making bad choices, and second acts like a total prick to a lot of people around him, and like he's a walking gift to grace this earth. The show is not blind to this. It points out exactly this within the dialogue. It's just that the show says, never mind, boys will be boys, and keeps on rewarding it. Margo, on the other hand, is shown to be facing real consequences for her decision, even though they were, in my opinion, based on real data rather than sympathies and friendships. It's just that this rhetoric that the show keeps rewarding, this myth about these big pioneers in space, these tough men out there facing adversity that the show keeps on regurgitating that grinds my gears, this isn't inherently a bad thing. Again, Ed has done a great service overall, but Danielle is objectively a way better candidate for the job. And say what you will, with being straight up toxic in the workplace and justifying it by calling it being pioneers is not cute, not sweet, and is not fun, and certainly is not productive. But the show evidently thinks otherwise when it comes to Ed. I want to emphasize that the writing for Ed is completely fine. You have to view him as a product of his time, and I think that the show displays that actually really well. It is just that the show itself kind of sways in a direction that I don't think is really good to go down to. While it points out Ed's flaws, it ultimately chooses to not pursue any repercussions for those flaws. He is continuously displayed as making flawed decisions, even back in season 2, but the show never really addresses consequences for Ed. Again, I understand that he did great things, but shouldn't there be any consequences on an institutional level? Additionally, the show allows for Ed to make the same decision the second time around. This season, Danny, the son of Gordo Stevens, is facing some personal difficulties. He has an addiction to alcohol. He isn't in the best of a place. So Ed does the same thing that he did for Danny's father. He goes on to talk about how a person who is lost needs to strive towards a purpose and be kept busy, and puts Danny, a clearly mentally unstable person, on a flight to Mars. because standards apparently do not exist when the plot demands it. Last time, somehow, he was allowed to do that and it didn't result in a big tragedy that would show that such a decision is bad. This time around, though, things go differently. I guess I should compliment the show on coming to its senses and finally admitting that a decision like that is nonsense, because it is Danny and his instability that causes a lot of damage on their mission to Mars. This is great, but it does raise eyebrows how apparently no one has standards for a mission that is even more arduous and dangerous than a mission to the moon. There is a slight caveat in the way things unfold, because Danny sort of relapses back into addiction, not entirely because it is hard to be on the mission itself, but rather because he has this weird obsession over Karen that has seemingly continued to exist after they hooked up one time a decade ago. Danny is trapped with Ed on the same ship and sees Ed talk to Karen over video messages, but instead of minding his own business, he becomes more and more obsessed over Karen and more spiteful and jealous towards Ed. I guess props for the show on following up on that whole disaster of a storyline between Karen and Danny in season 2. But that, I think, in a show like this, is just goofy to say the least. We are literally witnessing humanity advancing towards Mars in its journey among the stars. There are bigger fish to fry. This is another catchphrase that you may use to describe the show moving forward. And once again, we will be touching on this later. But the goofiness doesn't even end there. Because remember Kelly, the adopted daughter of Karen and Ed? So she is now a real biologist. And she goes to Danny, who had become the commander of the Mars mission for NASA, and weasels her way into the mission. She presents an argument about how she knows so much about biology and about potential life. And let me tell ya, she actually knows a lot about biology and potential life. Because for some reason, those few sentences seem to be the only argument that NASA needs to admit people into ranks of astronauts. Of course, I am oversimplifying, but you get the point. So she is on the mission. The race is on towards Mars. Then there is an emergency that strikes over at the Soviet Mars spaceship. Kelly is the one who happens to pick up their calls for help. A bit later, NASA rescues the Soviet crew, and she gets to meet the dude she spoke with. He is named Alexei. So he begins waxing about how he knew to contact her and some weird stuff like,
I knew you could be trusted.
And then they work together, and then they evolve into a relationship. And then they begin having sex on Mars, which leads to Kelly being pregnant. I want to remind you all that this is happening in the context of a very important mission to Mars. This is the very first mission where mankind has landed on Mars, and for some reason, Kelly cannot keep it in her pants. Of course, naturally, such a curveball as a pregnancy on Mars is neither accounted for nor particularly logical. But that's what happens when you accept someone as an astronaut after like 2 sentences and a bit of nepotism. And this causes a whole cascade of issues for the crew, because again, nobody was expecting a pregnancy on the very first manned mission to Mars, because who in their right minds would even get to that point? This also results in a ridiculous sequence of trying to get Kelly from the Mars surface to the orbit, since she can't give birth on Mars, because again, and I want to emphasize this, no one expects a pregnancy on Mars because of course they wouldn't. And this is the general attitude that the season has towards the Mars mission. I particularly dislike it for a simple reason. The show that we are discussing today is science fiction. It is a piece of speculative fiction. Getting pregnant on a foreign planet is not a bad plot point on its own. On paper, it is just an idea. It can be spun in whichever direction, but the childish execution that the show opts for is really very much less than stellar. What rubs me the wrong way is just how on board everyone is with entertaining this woman's stupid choices. The show displays everyone on the Mars crew seemingly sacrificing their own personal comfort and well-being because someone decided to have sex. The show kind of forgets what it is. This is a science fiction show, yes? This is a speculative fiction show, yes? Then go right ahead. Speculate. A Mars pregnancy can be spun into an interesting direction if they actually acknowledge the gravity of the situation within the show. Somehow, the show sees this plot development as a cute moment. I just see it as an insane level of selfishness and short-sightedness coming from Kelly and Alexei. And I'm not exactly sure that displaying everyone as suddenly being very happy to give up their own personal good on a long-haul mission for someone who clearly didn't afford the same situation a second thought is a good idea. There exists a very good piece of writing advice. Write every character as if they are the protagonist of their own story. So what happened to that? The show goes to extreme lengths in this instance to ignore every one of the crew's personal motivations. While one may raise an argument that the characters are merely side characters, this doesn't look good for the show. Is it really that hard to show some real strife? If you are aiming for such a plot point, you better actually show the weight that it actually carries. And that once again is the larger issue that is emerging within the show and within this season in particular. You can actually draw some clear-cut parallels between this season and season 1. Both seasons seasons present a plot within which mankind takes the next grand step in their space travel endeavors. Both of those steps are nothing to scoff at. Conquering the moon was already in itself quite a monumental task, but conquering another planet altogether, now that seems like an escalation of stakes. Let's keep in mind though that some of that escalation is offset by the experience that mankind has already gathered from their previous explorations. Yet still, another planet sounds like a big deal. If you remember season 1, you most likely also remember with what type of reverence the moon was treated. Back then, there was actual weight to the discoveries being made. Season 3 has no such reverence towards Mars, at least not to the same extent. Partly, it seems that way because of the really stupid storylines that the Mars cast are constantly entrenched in. But also, it's like the show itself puts in low effort to actually present Mars as monumental as it would actually be. Just look at how they play off the first of our kind setting foot on Mars.
Wait, they're going together. How inspiring.
There are elements of the Mars situation though that are enjoyable. For instance, the private sector stepping into the game provides interesting implications for the plot, but those implications are honestly mostly lost on the show. If you step back and look at this season, you can see just how unimaginative it is. What I would have wished to see of Helios is for them to be actually used as a new player. And what I mean by this is just anything other than what it was used for. I keep watching the show and the same problem reoccurs to me more and more. The show is so insanely insular, especially by the 3rd season. I want you to think about how Helios was used. It was introduced as a new player in the race, yet it took only a couple of episodes for Helios to become populated with characters that we already knew very well. When I watch this season, I cannot help but see Helios just as another vehicle to create drama between already existing characters. To an extent, this is entirely fair. The whole basis of bringing Karen along into Helios was because she already had a foot in the business. Her inclusion makes sense, but everyone else feel like add-ons that shouldn't have been there, because I think there was another, way more efficient way to shoot 3 birds with 1 stone. Imagine if we actually apply some imagination and synthesize the ideas of Helios and the overarching issue of nepotism. Now when you think about it, a few of the major mess-ups of the season derive from Kelly and Danny. Both of them got their way at least in part of their connections. My main issue in the show is that it doesn't particularly view these instances as the issues that they really are. Kelly's very real and very bad decision-making is not even acknowledged as that. Danny's inclusion is acknowledged as a mistake. Ed acknowledges that he feels as though he might have made a mistake by bringing Danny up there. Now imagine if the show did acknowledge them as issues as they are. Imagine if they decided to examine the angle of nepotism within the show. Even with the instance of Kelly, if you think just a bit more, there is another layer to be revealed. If you look at the scene where the Mars crew decides to sacrifice their own well-being in order to help out Kelly, you can see that they are not exactly deciding to help out a fellow astronaut. The show heavily focuses on the fact that Ed and Kelly are a father and a daughter, so they are also deciding whether to help out the commander's daughter. Yet another potential layer is revealed, a certain power imbalance. There are layers upon layers within the situation that the show simply lacks imagination to acknowledge. What it could reflect is a culture that is inherently flawed. It could raise questions about how exactly NASA or any of those agencies operate internally, displaying flaws within their decision-making. You have to remember that while we see individual characters making these decisions, they are still decisions that are being run through multiple levels and are signed off by multiple people. Whether they are carried by the fame and accomplishments of Ed, or for whatever other reason that is not purely based on facts, the show instead simplifies this. In the instance of Danny, we see Ed reflecting on this decision. However, this reflection doesn't go farther than him. There is no consideration on an institutional level as to what exactly this entails. The show doesn't acknowledge on a deeper level the fact that familial bonds or deeper relationships between crew members introduces a predisposition that can blind someone within positions of power. What is really baffling is that, at least at first, it felt like that is what they might have been aiming for during the 2nd season, with Gordo and the ginger guy. His name is actually Gary Piscotti. For the record, it is pointed out that Gordo might have been chosen due to favoritism or nepotism. That means the show is aware of this. It also felt as though Piscotti was there to display this further. He was being pushed around over something as arbitrary as his hair color. It felt like the show was kind of grasping at something interesting here, but it pisses it all away in season 3. And it turns out that the ginger color is just a quirk of Ed. It is like the show is aware that this is a problem, but doesn't try to recognize it as a problem at the same time, since it serves the overall attempt at keeping the show tied to the few characters they have. It is almost like they cannot acknowledge it outright, since it would directly undermine these sort of dynasties that they are building. Or maybe they are so deep into this idea of having their little universe revolve around their Skywalkers that they are incapable of seeing it as an issue. It is particularly funny as ever since the 1st season, the show tried to tackle various social and systemic inequities, yet this is the one they ironically do nothing about. You might say they tried to do this in season 4, but no. Whatever they wound up doing there is not addressing what we are discussing here, not the same thing. So how does Helios factor into this equation? Imagine if Helios was introduced with at least one character that was rejected from a position at NASA. I believe they had a very correct idea by trying to poach characters that worked at NASA. Someone like Biscotti could have been absolutely perfect for this. He saw how people like Ed treat others up close. Have him join Helios and have him prove that he would have been the correct choice all along. Or imagine if that one biologist who was rejected from a Mars mission in favor of Kelly was instead taken in by Helios. Kinda like what already happens with Ed in the show. That character could easily have served as a foil to Kelly, a contrast between her awful decision-making and a potential steady presence unburdened by the nonsense that Kelly indulges in. Or instead, they could have introduced a foil to Danny, an astronaut rejected from the mission only to be replaced by Danny, and then being contrast to Danny and him messing up all around. That is what keeps bothering me with the show. They're trying to establish the story that moves across generations of the same families, but it is not as cute as they think it is within the context. If you want to have nepotism, go ahead. Have it. It exists everywhere out in the world. Just don't dare to live under the illusion that it's as good as the show presents it as. It can be, but it has way more baggage attached than the show presents. I mean, this could have been also used to build the character of Kelly. Just have her be a spoiled brat and explain her choices that way. After all, she is descendant of Ed and Karen Baldwins. Have her be spoiled, have her be a brat, and have that bite Ed in the ass. At least that way Kelly would have even a modicum of character. Helios wouldn't need to be displayed as paragons of virtue in the situation either. It is just so disheartening to see potential commentary being made going to complete waste simply because the show has these rose-tinted glasses while approaching some of its subject matter and characters. This is yet another facet of the attitude problem that the show has. The general pattern here is that there are massive amounts of nuance being discarded all around. Kelly could have had way more nuance and be more complex if her actions were acknowledged as a mistake. This installment of the show thus far easily is the weakest. I think a certain amount of weirdness should be allowed in shows like this. Humans always get up to all kinds of weird and stupid stuff. This season though, it feels like it has a disproportionate amount of that mixed in. And it is sad to see that this is the engine with which the season chooses to power its plot. This elimination of nuance cheapens the show and makes it really unserious. Its storytelling begins to feel weightless, which is disappointing because you realize that the days of serious storytelling and speculation of season 1 might as well be long gone. And after such a season, one may think that the spiral downwards would only continue. That is the general trend in modern-day TV shows, is it not? Well, how does For All Mankind go forwards? I suppose it depends on your point of view. For me, I would say that it is better than season 3 at least. However, this season is just a bit disappointing, since it had plenty of opportunities to do something better than what it actually does. Now, if season 3 was somewhat in parallel with season 1, season 4 is somewhat a parallel with season 2. We jump ahead another decade, and are shown humanity to be settling in with the new reality of Mars being colonized. We are also shown humanity trying to mine asteroids, and of course, a certain amount of chaos ensues. Now let's go with a few things that season 4 has a correct idea about. There are the smaller things. For example, I love the character of Eli Hobson. He's the new administrator of NASA this season, taking over from Margo Madison. And what I really enjoy is that this character is fully the product of this timeline. He's said to have boosted Chrysler by focusing the company of electric vehicles, which came into play earlier in this timeline. And that is such a nice way to capitalize on the show's world building. It is a small but a nice payoff in that way. On the same token, I liked how they approached the applications for workers to go on the moon and on Mars. The process itself is displayed as more mundane than anything, and that is cool. These things are small, but they are nice to see from a world building perspective. Now, moving on to bigger things. What I at first appreciated the season overall is for the dynamic that it at least tries to bring to the table. Since Mars is now not just a couple of astronauts, but an entire colony, Mars now sees the need for a workforce to build and expand the colony. I believe that a similar thing also happens on the moon after they establish the bases there, but the show never really delved into that, perhaps deciding to save it for this season. This, I think, is great, and since NASA doesn't exactly have a workforce lying around, they begin to outsource it. Bringing in new people who are not part of the usual NASA, Roscosmos, or Helios bubbles is basically bringing in more variables into the equation. The last season did that to an extent. Helios astronauts stepping into the race towards Mars was that additional variable, albeit not even used that well, but let's move on. This is a great development in the engine of the show. I think it only makes sense. It is also a great place to produce conflict, since more and more variables are beginning to get out of NASA's control. There is way more logical and reasonable exposure to potential problems and issues. The season basically
basically writes itself. So how exactly does this season capitalize on these ideas? At first, the season follows the patterns of previous seasons to a comfortable extent. Just like clockwork, around the midway point of episode 1, things go wrong, people die, Kuznetsov dies, etc, etc. We also, like clockwork, get a lot of clunky exposition. This time around, they try very hard to convince you just how big of companions Kuznetsov, Danny, and Ed were. I mean, it makes sense, but the time jump situation really makes everything wonky. Again, I just don't buy it. And I am not going to shed a tear over something that wasn't properly fleshed out and was delivered via exposition and 1 or 2 scenes of vodka drinking back in season 3. It just reads as disingenuous, that's all. What they also go hard on is the regular workers' perspective. 2 of the workers talk about the need to finish the mission in order to get bonuses to their salaries. I do have a slight issue with that. It is not that this is a bad choice to begin adding mentions of these things off the bat, but I do think they had a great opportunity to play their cards differently for some additional narrative punch that they do not really use, sadly. Right away, they introduce the character of Miles Dale. He's a regular worker, not an astronaut. His utility in the plot is to get us into the perspective of the workers. He is introduced in episode 1 and becomes one of the focal characters moving forwards. Here's my proposition. Imagine if this introduction came at a slightly later time. Imagine if, at least for a couple of episodes, we focus solely on the perspective of the already existing astronauts. For a few episodes, contain the workers' struggles only to the remarks of Danny and Ed. For instance, I think the conversation that Danny has with Ed would work great if it was only that and existed without the context of Miles' perspective at that point.
And I'm getting a sense of real frustration below deck.
Yeah, who knew it'd be hard living on Mars?
Or only have these storylines intersect through the perspective of astronauts through scenes like this.
You know where we are right now, yes?
We're standing on another fucking planet. It does not work unless you take some personal responsibility, Miles.
If you think about it, the first 3 seasons focus solely on the perspectives of astronauts and some people attached to them. Season 4 could have continued that tradition, but thematically to its advantage, by continuing to ignore other perspectives until something goes truly wrong and they cannot anymore. Imagine if Miles' perspective gets staggered until midway of the season or later. Just, you know, drop some hints about something sketchy going on with the workers, have Danny remark on it a couple of times, make a little mystery out of it until the plot literally cannot ignore it anymore. Kind of like what they did with North Korea's landing on Mars back in season 3. I think that if they opted for this, they could have played up the initial accident of the season. Imagine if they begin widely venerating Kuznetsov's death at first, but then they used this event to galvanize the workers and show how they react to their colleague, and by extension them getting glossed over. Because it isn't just Kuznetsov that dies out there, but also at least one worker. Again, it would have been great thematically to gloss over their perspective at first and then be forced to see it after they upset the system of Mars enough. The way it is done, however, is serviceable, and this particular perspective makes sense. They simply take a more traditional and linear approach with it, which you cannot really condemn, but it could have been just a bit better with some tweaks. To the season's credit though, the second half of the season does pick up quite nicely, because at around midway point, there is a discovery of a very lucrative asteroid called Goldilocks. Goldilocks, similar to other milestones in the show such as Mars or the Moon, is used as an objective that everyone is after and the plot device to generate drama. Goldilocks also presents unique opportunities for plot that the show does end up using. I really liked how the struggles of the workers came in organically into the plot. It was also great to see the asteroid being used as a leverage by the workers. All of that is generally great. Is the execution perfect 100%? No, but I appreciate the idea. It is a new dynamic that the show hasn't really explored before. And with this, I guess this is where my praise should really end. I think that the reason why I initially enjoyed the storyline was because it really responded to my gripes with the show feeling isolated, by focusing to extreme extents on pre-existing characters. Yeah, well, that was cool, until it was not. There's one annoying pattern that the show copies from season 3, that is using new entities which should really shake up the dynamic of the show for the same characters. Again. So the last season did a little funny thing. It gave both Danny and Ed slots as the commanders of missions towards Mars at the same time. Basically, they were put in a competition and on kind of opposing sides. The season does the exact same thing, but it does so in a very ironic way. The season sees Danielle Poole in retirement, but then NASA Administrator Hobson invites her for a chat. You see, after episode 1 disaster with the asteroid, he explains to Danny that...
But what we do already know is that certain decisions were made in the run-up to the accident, breaking of protocols, and Colonel Peters' position as commander of Happy Valley has become untenable.
And because of that, the commander of the base on Mars called Happy Valley is being dismissed from his position. This development is absolutely hilarious, because Cunty, cover up, your bias is showing. Isn't it hell of a convenient that the show fires someone over making mistakes just to bring in an old character? It is here that the show literally puts into words just how much it favors its favorites. It is also a very nice touch that in the same conversation, the show points out just how much of a nuisance Ed Baldwin continues to be.
Ed Baldwin doesn't listen to anybody.
Yeah, that's a big part of the problem. He has been XO up there a long time, set in his ways, you might say.
And this season, Ed is still up in space. He's the executive officer of the Helios side of the Mars operations. He still holds power. Now, the funny thing, if we are to speak of protocols, is there is a hilarious scene that happens in season 3. During the Danny melodrama, Danny injures his arm and is given pills. Ed also does a funny thing in order to keep Danny attached to missions operations.
I'm sure you're not too happy about being transferred back up to the Phoenix because of that injury. I'm changing the medical protocol. How's that sound?
So instead of actually making sure that Danny is fine, he just moves the goalposts to accommodate Danny. And we know how all that ends up. This right here is some very blatant skirting of rules and certainly some protocols that should have gotten Ed in at least some amount of trouble, as it is these actions that contributed to a huge disaster that killed people. Yet nobody cares about that, because the show loves Eddie. In this show, if your name does not rhyme with Baldwin, well, get fucked. So please do not talk about firing someone over mistakes in decision making. At least be consistent in your approach. So eventually, Danny caves and agrees to command Happy Valley. But then the show becomes split between two sides, the astronauts and the workers. Ed, just like in season 3, ends up on the same side with Devayesa, and they proceed to manipulate the workers to get what they want. Danny is left in opposition as she heads Happy Valley on behalf of NASA. Once again, just like in season 3, we get the same characters occupy spaces that should have been better reserved for the new characters, to rethread the same things and conflicts between existing characters. The show triples down on its commitment to its characters, because why on earth is Ed still in space? Why is he in charge of anything? Season after season, we get to see people complain about how hard to manage this man is, and how much of an egomaniac he is. We also get to see time and time again him making terrible decisions and of course making things go wrong constantly and consistently. All of that is always there. Season 4 brings another dimension of complications for Ed being involved, his age. Yet, even if he is very clearly an old man, he is still there. But why? And it is also in this season that he continues to be the same as always, and the show continues to service this man time and time again. This time around, he conceals his medical condition because apparently nobody cares about the health of the astronauts anymore, and it is not a requirement at all. He also selfishly galvanizes the workers to be petty towards Danny, and at the end, he still comes out on top, as he, along with Dev, use the workers to steal the asteroid and actually succeed. Danny, very rightfully so, snaps at him multiple times this season.
Fuck you! I have been putting up with your shit for the last 30 years, watching you make wrong decision after wrong decision. You are just a pathetic old man!
Which indicates that the show is cognizant of just how much of a walking liability Ed is. But that doesn't even matter since the way everything is presented still favors Ed. Danny, while being absolutely correct about him and just trying to do her job, constantly gets the short end of the stick in order for the plot to service Ed. Not to mention a lot of other logic being ignored in order to keep Ed around. Usually, in any situation, there is at least some form of transition of power. If you really want to have Ed, just have him be in retirement on Mars. Why keep him in any form of power at all? This would also imply that there is somehow no one fitting to take over, which is complete nonsense. Ed's knowledge might have been a scarce resource back in seasons 1 and 2, but certainly shouldn't be in season 4. That is not to say that the season is not without other disappointments. A big disappointment for me personally was how Margo's storyline was handled. This might as well boil down to me expecting a bit too much from the show. It is just that I expected more intensity out of it. For instance, we see her live in the Soviet Union. This is a very interesting development with great opportunities for plot. Margo experiences a whole regime change during her time there. And we also get to meet the character of Irina Morozova. Irina invites Margo to work at Star City. She drops this ominous line.
Do we know each other?
I know you.
But you barely know me.
I've known you for a long time, Margo.
And usually when people drop lines like that in a piece of media, you expect there to be something more. Maybe a nice little twist, maybe a reveal, but it doesn't really amount to much. I suppose this is a reference to the fact that she is later on revealed to be a KGB handler for Sergei, a person Margo has been in contact with throughout the last few seasons and handed over a lot of sensitive information to, but that is not really particularly shocking or surprising. It just sort of is. Not to mention the way Margo and Alida are reunited. Again, the way it happens is kinda serviceable. It is decent, I guess. But the plot point isn't really used to its maximum potential. What occurs is that there is a big summit that happens. A lot of nations all come together in one place, and there happens to be Margo in there too on the Soviet side. And you would think that maybe something would go south and there would be some nice, well-earned suspense of Margo potentially being caught or discovered. But no, what happens is that Margo simply goes up to the hotel where Alida stays, walks into her room, and jump scares her. Is it necessarily bad? I mean, again, depends on your own perspective. On the surface, I guess it's passable. I guess it is also somewhat of a callback to the second season, where Margo goes to Alida's place while Alida is in the bathroom. But I know it was unexciting for me when there was a plethora of more exciting paths to go down. I suppose they went for a more emotional angle, which again, serviceable I suppose. But there were way spicier options. This choice is particularly perplexing when you consider the fact that, for some reason, Dev taking back Helios with Alida and Kelly received a whole cartoonishly stupid scene of them dramatically barging into a board meeting and just spouting the latest plot developments out loud as if that's how real business works. And do not even get me started on the whole Alida and Kelly storyline. The whole reveal of Margo being alive also feels kind of weightless. I thought there would be a bigger deal about her coming out on Soviet television and revealing that she was alive after all. I thought it would upset America in many ways, maybe even make it question its own security apparatus, some larger implications. There is some protesting against Margo when she's announced to go to the US on behalf of the Soviets, which I can appreciate. In the beginning of the season though, the show makes a mention that M7 was founded and was supposed to end the distrust between the countries.
The agreement aims to end the competition and distrust.
Wouldn't the reveal of Margo being alive and in the USSR sort of break that trust? The former opponents of the US are holding a traitor of their country. Did the US know she was alive? Was the US aware of her being smuggled away in the USSR? Maybe this is grounds to really shake up the alliance. Not to mention the blowback from the general public and some fuel to the fire that those conspiracy nuts started back in season 3. Before you go into comments trying to explain this or that, it is okay and you can certainly have your headcanons, but the show itself should explain and explore this, not you. The show once more prioritizes the relationship between Alida and Margo in this instance, instead of focusing on what it means for the space exploration. Again, patterns upon patterns. For me in particular, it is just sad that the show has this very unique plot on its hands, but it doesn't do enough to fully capitalize on it. Again, it feels like once more the show just doesn't have enough imagination to properly speculate on the notions that they have. There are some other weirdly dumb decisions mixed in there as well though, like Margo, while, according to her own words, being watched 24/7, decides to meet with Sergei out in some parking lot, thus exposing Sergei and getting him killed. Also, isn't it a bit odd that the Soviets go through all of that effort to help Margo defect to the other side, yet they don't even use her in their space program? The show explicitly states that she hasn't worked on any of that stuff for a decade. But why? They felt plenty comfortable taking intel from her for years, but now that they have her there at their disposal, they keep her away? Did they grant her asylum because they liked her? The workers unionizing storyline also comes with its own weirdness. They have a lot of scenes where, for instance, they all get together to discuss these issues, but the way these scenes are directed is just so funny. It's like each of them just yell out a buzzword and everyone goes crazy over that. It is just a bit, to use a technical term, cringe. Not to mention the entire black market storyline on Mars, or Ed having a little relationship with a Soviet astronaut. That is just corny. What is particularly disheartening about this season is that it felt as though, for a brief moment there was something of a course correction. Introducing new dynamics and characters was certainly the right direction, yet the season fails to properly capitalize on it. It still does not manage to recognize the flaws within its formula that arose right after the first season ends. We still get a lot of the usual focus on interpersonal drama present within past seasons. We still get some contrivances here and there to stir along the plot. In summary, the trajectory that the show chooses for itself, the path that the plot takes, is an expected one. Humanity goes to the moon, then it sets its eyes on Mars, and then on asteroids and so on. This plot as the framework is obviously fine, but that is just it. It is just a framework. But I think that the show as it goes on has more and more trouble filling it in. Season 1, as I've mentioned, probably works great because it hasn't strayed that much from reality. The show has tons of material to work with, and it does so just fine. But as it goes forth, it is clear that the lack of material is becoming a bit of an issue for the plot of the show. It is not like the show has wrong ideas about these milestones. If boiled down to the simplest of notions, it kinda makes sense how things are moving along. Does it make complete sense? No, but it is serviceable. But the show sometimes takes such strangely unimaginative and shallow directions along the way, partly, as we have already discussed, to favor their own characters. Furthermore, to favor some characters more over the others. The plot also fails to fully account for some of the narrative choices. As a piece of speculative fiction, it sometimes really fails to speculate. I would like to think that there is no bad idea, only bad execution. There are some exceptions to that, of course, but the show never really strays into that territory. The truth of the matter is that the show is full of interesting possibilities when it comes to plot, but the execution is sometimes so astoundingly bad. It is a big shame, because when the show shines, it really does shine a lot. Those moments are becoming few and far in between. And when it doesn't shine, you're in for a very tumultuous ride, and not a very nice one. This pattern is rather troubling. The decline within the show, I think, is quite an obvious one. And as the show will move on, I am not exactly sure it will become better. It only makes you question, after a while, what is the show even attempting to do? These opening shots, this entire scene that sets the stage for the show, is quite obviously monumental. It is within these opening scenes that we are presented with the main divergence within the history that would ultimately result in the entirety of For All Mankind. While the plot is quite a relevant concept, there is yet another one that is just as, if not of greater relevance, that is world building. While it is odd to put history in those terms, that is what it essentially is in the context of For All Mankind. There are a couple of layers to world building in the show. The first one is perhaps the most obvious, that is the way that technology is advancing, the events that either unfold differently or not at all on the United States side of things. The way that the show handles those events is relatively okay. You can sense that a lot of meticulous research went into planning and making sure that the timeline that the show presents is viable. There might be some qualms here and there, but you can quite easily put those aside for the sake of entertainment. Yet there is another, less pronounced layer of world building that exists outside of what I just described. That is the world building that surrounds everything else. That is, for example, the way history is used and altered in other nations besides America. I believe that this particular layer is not quite as airtight as the primary one. This shouldn't come as some big surprise. It would be, and is, extremely hard to keep track of the history of the entire world, let alone to speculate on how it would be altered. But the question that I would like to raise today is just how much is it a problem that the show doesn't show the same care across every level of its world building? Because you may give as much of a benefit of the doubt towards the show as you may like, but it is not exactly like the show was necessarily forced to pursue this particular idea for its plot. It chooses to be an alt history science fiction show, therefore it should, in my view, strive to do so to the best of its ability. After all, world building is what foregrounds the main story. It is what serves as a foundation for the story at hand, and therefore it can be argued that it is a crucial element for the show to get correct. Yet what happens when the show isn't as careful with its world building? There is one very particular example in history diversion that interested me the most. While initial divergence was interesting enough, there is yet another idea more enticing for me personally, for reasons which I think you will come to realize. So there is an interesting liberty that the show takes with history. They make the Soviet Union survive. It doesn't collapse like it did back in 1991. It certainly is an interesting hypothetical. The ending of the third season, the flash forward into 2003 with Margo living in the Soviet Union, still remains the best flash forward. It is also to see the utility in its survival within the show. The US still needs a competitor for the race, and they seem to also imply that the race would make the Soviets better off. The TV show makes an argument that it is successful through mostly economical means. The initial victory of landing on the moon first seemingly really pushed them forward. It is quite obvious that the show too likes this idea, but the way it is ultimately utilized is neither really airtight, nor is it in any way exciting. There are two ways through which you can view this inclusion of the Soviet Union after 1991. One of the ways is through how this surviving Soviet Soviet Union is presented. Season 4, I think, would have been a great opportunity for the show to speculate on how things would be different in Soviet Union. And it does, but the way it does is really unexciting. Season 4 shows Margo living in the Soviet Union, tucked away from all the space drama, going about her days. She tries over and over to get into the Soviet space program, gets turned away. Then there is a coup. She gets thrown into KGB prison. Then she gets taken out of prison and employed by Irina Morozova into the space program. We get to see her in the meetings, advising people around her. We get to see her discover some mistakes, and people get punished for it by mysteriously disappearing. Then she returns to the United States, and we do not see any more of Soviet Union. Now, I don't even know how to describe it except for the show going for the most cliche and uninteresting thing they could have ever done. I think it is a bit funny that a show bends over backwards for the Soviet Union to survive, and then has a character defect to this new and improved Soviet Union, only for it to amount to some cheap KGB drama. I cannot even really fault the show for doing this, I guess, because sure, KGB would still probably exist within that timeline, but it is so insanely strange because they had a unique opportunity to show a slightly different approach to the Soviet Union, but all it devolved into was just KGB being bad, Soviets being dumb, and saved by the American. That's it? I am sorry, but why did we even bother to go into Soviet Union if that was all we were going to get? It is not like we gain any important information about the current Soviet Union that becomes in any way relevant. It doesn't even speculate on something new or different. It is just the Soviet Union that everyone already preconceives. I believe that this is the point where you start to realize that the show is written by a very specific point of view. That is the American point of view. I am not saying this to be mean. It just is. Because I do think that it says a lot that the show is perfectly capable of envisioning the United States within this timeline in great depth. The economic, social, and geopolitical facets are all tackled in the show to great extent. Yet the Soviet Union remains a stereotype. My personal issue comes from the fact that the show is brave enough to state that the Soviet Union would survive under the circumstances in the show, but if you are brave enough to do this, then fully commit to it. And trust me, the show says some very wild things that I am not sure it even understands the repercussions of. So here's the thing. Before seasons 3 and 4 came out, I used to be of the opinion that the show is indeed displaying a better future for humanity. I used to agree that the show is quite optimistic in its approach towards humanity, and it does overall frame the events in a very glossy way. But after seasons 3 and 4, whenever someone tries to say that For All Mankind is some better and more optimistic timeline, I laugh. Because from where I stand, it's not much better at all. From my point of view, it is a dystopia. Now let's pull back a bit. Each season begins with these nice little montages. They serve a few purposes. One of them is to provide the necessary exposition for the audience as to what has happened during the time jumps. Another one is to display how exactly the show's timeline differs from the real timeline. On the surface, this is fun. It is cool to see certain events play out differently, but the cool and the fun factor really wore off for me as the time went on. You know, for a show that presents itself as an alternate history, it really executes the alternate history rather poorly. Now, what these montages and the context in the show itself do is that they become more and more implausible. I think it is not to the show's advantage that they keep bringing up how the timelines are different for funsies. From the way I see it, we already had an initial point of divergence. That divergence in itself already carries huge implications, and they probably needn't explain the butterfly effect. What really doesn't make sense is how these montages keep referencing events from our timeline, but with slight tweaks. When it happened in the first and the second season, you can kind of forgive it, but I don't think it should be happening forwards. After a certain point, it stops being fun and starts being very heavy-handed. Because after a certain point, the timeline within the show shouldn't be comparable to our timeline. It is an alternate history. We are already way beyond divergence. So why do we keep spawning back into the main timeline? Why do we keep colliding into it? The best way for me to illustrate it is the survival of the Soviet Union, because it sure as hell does not make a ton of sense. And what I will discuss next is all in the details and absolutely will come off as me splitting hairs. That is just is. But it is these details that foreground the science fiction narrative that we are witnessing, and these are fundamental details that explain how this world exists in the first place. So it is in the little cutesy montage at the beginning of season 3 that it is essentially explained that the solidarity movement in 1980 is essentially squashed. In the real timeline, it isn't. The mere idea of this is already hilarious, and here's why. The show operates on quite weird assumptions. It is extremely odd already that in two very different timelines, the same movement with the same name in the same time existed. Again,
again, I want to emphasize, we are already decades into a timeline that is very different, especially for the Soviet Union, since they made it first to the moon. What the show seemingly fails to grasp is that the solidarity movement is not just some event that happens to pop up like some unescapable Nexus event. The movement was and should be approached as a symptom, and it is a symptom that stems from very specific set of circumstances. So tell me how it makes any sense that in this very different timeline, this exact movement still comes to exist. This is where there is a lack of foresight in adding this event in the first place. The show inadvertently asserts that the circumstances were similar if not the same. Again, doesn't make sense, but the show really insists on this. They are digging this hole themselves, so we have no other choice just to accept it as fact. The bigger problem here, I think, is that the show makes even a grander assumption with this choice. They assume that because the solidarity movement was quashed, the Soviet Union never fell. This is a very nonsense and contrived way of explaining it on multiple levels, and I can explain to you at least one. Now, the reason why I was even in any way interested in seeing the Soviet Union survive is because I myself come from a post-Soviet country. Funnily enough, I come from a country that was the first to become independent from the Soviet Union. First of all, it is incredibly stupid to assume that because solidarity didn't happen, no other countries would ever bother to do something about their independence. You may lament about how the show says that the USSR is better off in this timeline, and I would direct you once again to the solidarity movement existing. Again, its existence basically cements the notion that USSR was in fact at least in a very similar state in the show as it was in real life, so that surely was not the case. It is a fact that solidarity did inspire other movements and was one of the first, but what is also a fact is that solidarity once again is only a symptom. Eliminating a symptom in this case doesn't fix the core issue. For all mankind in this kind of world building takes an overly simplistic approach of saying that if this didn't happen, then nothing else did. That is just not realistic, especially since there were entire countries under some very real oppression, and crushing solidarity doesn't cut it as a valid reasoning for the Soviets to stay afloat. Season 4 brings another round of the same nonsense. Another decade deeper, into an alternative timeline, we hear in a montage that Gorbachev introduced the two reforms that happened in real life as well, Glasnost and Perestroika. These two policies were designed for the betterment of the Union, to modernize the economy and to democratize the Union. Again, if they happened in this timeline, there had to be similar circumstances calling for them to happen. Changes like that are usually a response to a need for change in the first place. The show displays these policies as having worked. In the introductory montage into season 4, they remark how
and Perestroika has transformed the once dour Russian capital into a city of light.
This again is quite an overly simplistic and revisionist unfolding of events. What happened in real life, I would say, makes much more sense. Through these policies, Gorbachev encouraged people to be more outspoken and critical towards the government. He actually promoted freedom of speech and expression. He was seeking to democratize the system at least in some way because the situation seemingly demanded it. Yet it had the exactly opposite effect. It didn't preserve the system, it destroyed it. Gorbachev inadvertently opened the doors to the destruction of the Union. Because freedom of speech became more allowed, it created an environment for nationalist spirits to be fostered and countries to actually push for independence. And I want to remind you that the show basically says that because they squashed solidarity, every other country collectively gave up and then didn't use their chances to push for independence. The show, for some reason, makes an assumption that the Union proceeds to last because it is economically okay. But let me tell you, Romas Kalanta nesusidegino dėl to, kad jam trūko pinigų. All the other countries that became members of the Union unwillingly have quite extensive histories with it. And honestly, it is rather funny that the show assumes that just because the economy was better, all the countries would throw away their nationalistic moods. Especially since, without a fail, this show places so much importance on the American people and American way of life. I get that Chernobyl didn't happen, nor did a lot of other things, but that doesn't change the fundamental fact that the Union was oppressive towards other cultures. Not to mention the fact that it had to be bad enough for solidarity to try and rise. Again, seeing the Soviet Union under this scenario being depicted as thriving is honestly ridiculous, and comes off as a bit insulting, because I really doubt that my country or others would just sit silently just because they have McDonald's now. The fact of the matter is that, if you want to mess with history and present a different timeline, at least present something different rather than some cliché KGB shenanigans once you actually get to the Soviet Union. It is not even that the Soviet Union surviving is some god-awful move, but it does come with a lot of implications that have to be carefully thought through, and it really doesn't seem like the show does the required thinking. Sure, they might explain it in the confirmed spin-off titled Star City that focuses on the Soviet space program. This doesn't really change the fact that it is nonsensical in the original show, and I think that while it is cute that the show keeps referring to real history, it certainly makes no sense from the world-building standpoint.
point. It doesn't make sense for an alternate history, now full decades diverting away from our timeline, to keep warping back into the original timeline. Yet, while I am arguing that this is nonsense, it is not unlike it serves no purpose. There is an argument to be made that these collisions between timelines are not completely without basis. The words that I am looking for at the moment are cognitive estrangement. It is a term in science fiction and narratology that is coined by a man called Darko Suvin. Science fiction is a form of speculative fiction. In comparison to fantasy, science fiction, instead of deriving itself from full-blown imagination, usually stems from some form of plausibility. Science fiction usually uses that plausibility for all sorts of things. It can provide commentary, forcing the viewer to in some way reflect. For instance, things in science fiction such as novums, another term coined by Suvin which describes innovations in science fiction that are plausible, are used to display the potential repercussions that the technology might have. The concept of the novum in Darko Suvin's theory is flexible in its plausibility. It must be logically coherent within the story's context, even if it doesn't exist in our own world. It is this plausibility yet contrast that fuels other science fiction shows such as Black Mirror. The appeal of Black Mirror is the idea that what we are presented with seems to be like something that could be, or at least in part is real. Black Mirror's forecasts are usually dull and not entirely optimistic, which makes Black Mirror a great vehicle to provide commentary on society, as well as to be, in some sense, a warning. But it wouldn't work well if there wasn't that feeling of plausibility. Yes, the possibilities presented in the show are not quite there yet, but it is that strange familiarity that makes one's mind stir. Cognitive estrangement exploits exactly that, this closeness yet distance. For All Mankind is no stranger to this. For instance, the technology shown, all of the spacecrafts and other technological advancements would fall right into the definition of novums. With this type of logic, you could say that these collisions with our timeline are also supposed to serve the same purpose, to create this feeling of familiarity. It also serves a contrastive purpose. It is way easier to digest a timeline if it is put in more simplified terms, such as a movement being squashed or not, or a scientist surviving instead of dying and thus changing the outcome of a certain race. It is way easier to see similarities and differences that way. It also serves as a reminder of how much humanity would have advanced or regressed if certain decisions were approached differently. But we must be careful not to be carried away by these higher intentions to serve as the storytelling of a science fiction narrative, because while this might be the case, I must emphasize that once again, there has to be one element fulfilled for the cognitive estrangement effect to work: plausibility. Whatever we are presented with has to be, at least on some level, plausible. Otherwise, it doesn't really work as well. And this is exactly where I personally kept being taken out of the story, because the entire argument surrounding the Soviet Union is not sufficiently airtight. It works great for the first season, a bit less so for the second, but it can still work. But as the show goes onwards, it begins losing that feeling that Suvin describes. Again, as much fun as it is to see Al Gore become the president of the United States, it makes very little actual sense. And I will admit, on a visceral level, I hate that they keep doing this. Historic events are not some canon or nexus events or nodes within that space-time continuum. It is unimaginative at best, and at worst, it cheapens the show as a whole. I cannot stress enough how unserious the show comes off when it commits these choices. And as much as you may defend these choices, they will only decrease in plausibility, because our timeline and the show's timeline diverged literally decades ago, and that divergence was already a huge one. A lot of what we just discussed amounts to background details and world building, but it is this world building, I would argue, that is quite important. This is a science fiction that we are discussing. Proper world building is crucial in order to tell a story efficiently and effectively. You may ignore it for the sake of the story itself, but the foundation that keeps the story together is slowly deteriorating. These opening shots, this entire scene that sets the stage for the show, is quite obviously monumental. It is within these very first scenes we can observe quite an interesting phenomenon, as people gather to watch a monumental achievement within the history of humankind. We do not see much excitement. Instead of cheers or commotion, we only get to see solemn silence and contemplation. Some characters even go as far as to say,
500 million people.
Is this really happening?
As much as there is blabbering about how this is an achievement for everyone, you certainly wouldn't be able to tell as much from these reactions. There is an important context to these reactions, of course. This is a reality that is not like our own. It is not Americans who land on the moon first, but rather the Soviets. Therefore, it is not too hard to see why there are no audible cheers. It establishes quite simple and logical conflict: us versus them. It is here that the show begins building its overarching argument. On the surface, For All Mankind may seem like a show that should be first and foremost about space, the programs, the spaceships, the technological advancements. It certainly is about humanity's journey towards advancement, but it isn't just about space or technology. It is not just a story of technological development. For All Mankind, as the name might suggest, sees humanity itself as an integral part of this journey, because the truth of the matter is that scientific equations during peacetime would not get humanity anywhere. What this first scene displays is that there would be no progress without human input, no advancement without some form of a drive. I believe that these are the reasons why the show is, first and foremost, not a science fiction show, but rather a drama. Characters, one could argue, are just as or even more important than any advancement displayed on the show. This is the argument that, in my view, the show maintains throughout its run. Within the confines of the plot mechanics, you can also see various currents at play: division and union, fission and fusion between characters and their actions. There are also many other emotions at play here: excitement, fear, hope, grief. A carefully crafted equilibrium between these elements is what seemingly drives humanity forward within For All Mankind. Every storyline within the show in some capacity can be viewed through this perspective and be fitted within this grander argument of how we as humans affect our own development and how such developments affect us. You needn't look far to find examples. It is within the first season that we see the Baldwin family, consisting of Edward Baldwin as the husband, Karen Baldwin as the wife, and their son Shane. Edward Baldwin is an astronaut who works for NASA, therefore his inclusion is a reasonable prerequisite for this particular show. Yet the show, while being centered around space exploration, does not exactly pull its focus away from Karen, the wife of the astronaut. Karen is quite a product of her time. She is the wife that meets the societal expectations of that period. She centers her life around the home sphere. Her purpose is seemingly to contribute to her husband's aspirations rather than her own personal ambition. Due to what her husband's job entails, Karen is left to look after their home and their son. What happens is that their son dies due to an accident that occurs. This, of course, is quite a tragic turn of events. It is indeed a unique situation. An astronaut is up on the moon, fulfilling an important mission to his country. When he and his wife experience this collective loss, while they are separated by thousands of miles, it is still very much a shared loss that does transcend all distance. I believe that by taking this approach, by focusing on the entire family rather than on the one individual that is perceived to be important, the individual, in this instance being Edward, makes the correct choice. Because even if Ed is up there, on the moon, he's still very much bound by his own background. Another important dimension to this tragedy is the dynamic that existed within their family. Ed, as much as Karen, is also a product of the times. During one of the last conversations he has with Shane, he chooses a tough approach to parenting, and the conversation is not the nicest one. This also only adds another layer of tragedy to the situation, as Ed's own parenting mistakes hang over him in the subsequent scenes. Ed is of course a wreck after finding out, resorting to alcohol, being all alone up on the moon. Ed also begins ignoring all communications from NASA and also imprisons a Soviet cosmonaut. These are actions that of course put the entire mission into jeopardy. This of course is not something that has a high probability of happening, but it is still a consideration, a speculation that I think is worth visiting, because it wasn't something out there in space that threw a wrench in humanity's journey forwards. It was us ourselves that upset the mission. I believe that there is an important question to be raised here. It may not be explicitly or implicitly said, but it is still a consideration to be had. Towards what point does a person's connection to Earth become a liability? While you may completely understand Edward's suffering, to what point is it justified for him to jeopardize the mission? This may not be a humane question to ask, but it is certainly a pragmatic one, because we are discussing a mission in space. We are discussing another step forward in humanity's journey as a whole. That is just the thing though. The answers to these questions are as nebulous as whatever exists out there, yet there are other expressions of these sentiments. Molly as a character was introduced right from the first season. During the first season, we get to see her be quite an asset to NASA. She's headstrong and doesn't take crap from anyone. She gets the job done. Season 2, however, shows her in a slightly different light. It is in the face of trouble and adversity that real character within a person is brought out, and this is exactly what happens with Molly. We get to see Molly on the moon, out there, with other colleagues on the surface, carrying out a mission. It is there and then that a solar flare event breaks out. She manages to get inside a cave to protect herself from the radiation, yet she sees a moon rower tipped over and a person unconscious on the ground nearby. The radiation emitted by the flare is powerful and can have severe effects or even be lethal. She faces a hard choice, whether to remain in safety and protect herself or to try and save him. It is hard to discern which choice is the correct one. You may look at it from a pragmatic lens. If Molly was to remain in safety, she would protect herself, yet her colleague would die. If she attempts to save him, both of them get their lifespans shortened. To cut one life short or to severely affect aspect too. Watching a moment like this being played out on screen might make the answer seem simpler. A more pragmatic and logical choice might seem for Molly to cut her losses and remain put. The man is already out there, and she is still safe. Yet the choice that Molly makes, that is to threaten her own life and save her colleague, may not seem as a particularly pragmatic one. But what I cannot help but think about is the fact that Molly is right there, at that moment. She doesn't just see a character, she sees another person with a life to be lived, a fellow human who could still be saved. So of course she goes out there, knowing the peril of such a trip, and saves her colleague. The action is of course a heroic one, and what follows next is a storyline that sees Molly grappling with the consequences of her decision. It is not a storyline that necessarily serves the narrative of that particular season, but it does serve as another expression of the themes that the show aims for. Molly commits an act of sacrifice, and her storyline then displays the very real and very tangible price that she has to pay. Saving a single person may not mean much within a grander scale. After all, the man she saved was not exactly the most important among the personnel, but that I think is what makes Molly's actions all the more heroic. She didn't think about whether the person she was saving was important or not. She didn't stop to weigh those variables. It was simply an act of a person saving another person. It was a selfless act, and yet another component of humanity that the show sought to emphasize. This act can also be read within the wider context of the show, that it does indeed take a certain type of a person to be up there, a person that is not completely and entirely beholden to their own self-interests. It takes a certain selflessness to expose oneself to the dangers of space for the sake of all mankind. Despite possessing many flaws, Season 3 provides us with two major storylines that highlight the show's stance on humanity even more. On one hand, we have Ellen, and on the other Jimmy. We shall focus on the former first. In the third season, she is shown to become the President of the United States of America. She and her husband also both happen to be queer, who got married in previous season to fend off any suspicion, as they both began being investigated for being gay. Of course, Ellen being queer and being a president in a society that still hasn't progressed towards universal acceptance is a bold narrative choice, and I believe it is all too easy to see the storyline as pandering to the woke or whatever label some may place on those to which the storyline matters. It is all too easy to dismiss the storyline as unnecessary, but I would argue the storyline matters to all of us, and it would be a grave mistake to assume otherwise. This storyline in Season 3 culminates when Ellen Wilson stands before the crowd and comes out as gay. In her speech, she says,
"A brave American hero, serving his country on the surface of Mars at this very moment. But I can stop lying to you right here, right now, and give you the simple truth. I'm gay, and I have been since the day I was born."
The character of Will Tyler that Ellen mentions is an astronaut in the Mars mission. It is during the Mars mission, while being overwhelmed by the new planet, that Will Tyler decides to come out.
Especially in the neighborhood I grew up in, you just didn't tell people you were gay.
This, of course, causes considerable upset, both from the societal perspective and from the pragmatic perspective that concerns the mission. While it is clear that this decision is indeed not the most optimal one, it is a decision that had to be taken, as evidenced by Ellen's speech. Of course, you can disagree with it, and I think that we are meant to an extent to disagree with it. It is an apparent transgression that caused all of the attention to be diverted away from the core mission to Mars. Sure, but it is an impulse that, according to the show, simply had to happen. For a moment, I would like to refer to Season 1. Season 1 focused quite heavily on women being integrated into the NASA Moon program. This, for the society at hand, was a move that challenged their perceived social norms. This is displayed through a variety of facets, but most prominently displayed through the character of Karen. Karen, being a woman of her time, is quite opposed to the idea of women in space. She displays apprehension towards her friend Tracy, who becomes an astronaut. Karen voices her opinion that women are not supposed to be up in space, and it is not hard to see why Karen behaves in this particular way. Karen is a woman who quite clearly fits into the standards established by society at hand. Tracy, however, represents a change within those standards, which clearly upsets Karen's own perception of the world and herself. Tracy, in a way, serves as an existential threat to Karen as she knew herself. It is here within this conflict that we may understand what the show is attempting to communicate. Are they simply norms, or are they limits? Are they a proper way of life, or are they a prison? Through the storylines of both Karen and the women on the space program, I believe the answer to this is presented clearly. It is in later seasons that Karen goes on to move on from being simply an accessory to her husband's life to becoming a capable businesswoman, from being not just a businesswoman, but an owner of an entire establishment in space. A storyline like this makes you ponder how much potential, just how much talent is being limited through these arbitrary lines and limits. But all of this doesn't happen out of nowhere within the show. This entire progress is kicked into motion by the Soviets sending a woman to the moon. It is yet another transgression against the social norms that America is shown to hold, a challenge to their way of life. But that transgression, that pressure, still had to happen for the subsequent progress to occur. Therefore, Will Tyler's transgression can be seen as necessary in equal measure. Of course, the action might be seen as misplaced, but it may as well always have been seen as misplaced. A transgression will always be seen as transgression until commonly accepted as otherwise. But it is this moment that becomes part of Ellen's drive to come out and ultimately take humanity's journey forward yet another step. I believe that what the show displays here is twofold. It shows that humanity is plenty capable of limiting itself, of establishing arbitrary boundaries that impose unnecessary restrictions, but it is also plenty capable of removing them, of removing these needless obstacles. Why shouldn't Will Tyler be allowed to serve his country, to realize his potential while also fully living in freedom? Then we have the latter, Jimmy Stevens. Jimmy Stevens is the son of Tracy and Gordo Stevens, two astronauts that sacrificed their lives at the end of Season 2 to save the base on the moon. Season 3 sees them venerated for their sacrifices, with a statue erected to commemorate the couple. Jimmy Stevens exists in an interesting context. Within the plot, he exists quite isolated from the rest, and it is obvious why that is the case thematically. He has grown up in quite a dysfunctional household. By Season 3, he has lost his parents, his brother Danny has become an astronaut, and therefore he gets all the attention. This leaves Jimmy relatively neglected in the grander scheme of things. Therefore, it is not surprising that he finds company in quite a sketchy group of people. He becomes friends with a group of people that are denying the narrative proposed by NASA. They believe that what the agency says happened to Jimmy's parents isn't exactly what happened. The thing about this is that it is true to an extent. It isn't fully disclosed to the public why exactly Tracy and Gordo had to make their fatal run, but the people he gets involved with take it to extremes. It is very clear just how Jimmy is manipulated. A young man without a strong support system, in the shadow of both his parents and his brother, is very clearly a vulnerable person that can be quite easily swayed. And that is exactly how these conspirators rope him in. Admittedly, from the way the character is portrayed, I am not entirely sure that Jimmy himself believes these theories, at least not to the extremes that these people are proposing, but it would be understandable why he would be disillusioned with NASA. A lot of his trauma stems from NASA being involved in his life. It's what makes him the perfect target for the conspirators. All of this results in the bombing of a NASA center. There are a lot of deaths, a lot of destruction. While it can be argued that the storyline itself is quite hyperbolized, it is not entirely inconceivable. Distrust towards the government, channeled by the wrong people, can certainly lead to extreme results, and I believe that while Ellen's storyline displayed how much humanity is capable of moving forwards and progressing, Jimmy's storyline displays how humanity is equally as capable of destruction. This event quite literally sets back the cause, as NASA and the entire country would need to recover from such an event. It also represents a current that would always naturally emerge. There always will be a pushback, no matter how rational or irrational, no matter how noble the cause may be, there will always be discontent and doubt and skepticism. Yet Season 3 introduced another interesting edge to the entire space exploration equation, a private player, a company called Helios. The introduction of a private player under these circumstances mean a few things. First, it introduces an interesting dynamic into the mix. A private company is not exactly beholden to the same standards as a government agency is beholden to, and therefore they are able to do things differently. We see in Season 3 that due to this, Helios becomes a real threat towards NASA and Roscosmos. They serve a similar purpose that the Soviets served towards the US in Season 1. They provided competition that would push the space exploration further. What they also provided is a slightly different approach towards space exploration itself. The head of the company, Devayesa, is driven by his own personal ambition to go to Mars. Within the company, it is basically his pet project. He is the visionary that convinces people around him to take on this venture. It is not completely unlike the motivations that fuel NASA. Helios is merely another facet of it. Yet there is an interesting moment that comes in the latter half of the season. The situation on Mars develops in quite inconvenient ways. We get to see the reaction of Helios to this development.
We no longer share your optimism. Helios has squandered billions on this fantasy of yours. We've decided to pivot back to our core business, mining helium-3 on the moon. There will be no more missions to Mars.
What we see here is space exploration being quantified in different measures. Since Helios is, after all, a for-profit company, we get to see space exploration being framed through that specific lens, a viewpoint motivated not exactly by the desire to expand further, but more so by the desire to see a return on investment. A similar sentiment is further carried over into Season 4. Season 4 sees the Mars colony expanding, and therefore needing a workforce. We see people of desirable skills be hired by Helios and sent to Mars under promises of appropriate compensation. It is in this season that I believe most of the novelty of space exploration has already worn off. The magic of discovery was already slowly disappearing in Season 3, but Season 4 already sees the society as a whole waking up from the dreamy glamorized visions of humanity conquering the cosmos and getting into the practicalities. The people within the show are no longer primarily motivated by this collective ideal to advance, but rather by survival. Our main cast no longer consists of just these visionaries ready to put their personal needs aside for humanity. We now get to see real people motivated by the very real need to survive. These people cannot afford to live off of these lofty ideas of colonizing the solar system. They have real issues, they have families to take care of, they potentially have debts to pay. This is where Helios comes in and the show finally gets into the nitty-gritty reality that would actually be colonizing other planets. The first episode has these lines of dialogue.
We don't get that asteroid back to Mars, we don't get our bonus. You know I need the money.
This clearly indicates that there is an incentive system in play, clearly a response to the changing motivations of the people who are on Mars, since again, lofty dreams cannot exactly pay bills. Helios being a company is after their own needs, they want profit, so of course they seek to increase their profits. This leads to workers being severely underpaid. Understandably, the workers react appropriately. While the company is looking after their own survival and profit margins, the workers are looking after the exact same thing. And it is here that the main conflict arises. The workers strike against their employer. There forms an entire counter-current to the mission on Mars. We see the workers begin causing complications for the astronauts, sticking rods into their wheels to get the attention that they want. It leads to some disastrous results. A person dies, some are injured, the entire mission gets out of order. You can quite clearly see the workers' argument. They were promised, and they feel their promise is not being fulfilled. It is not unlike Helios cannot fulfill it. The company simply won't, as that would mean giving up part of their own profit, and that is just merely another expression of humanity, greed, to an extent selfishness. Not to say that it didn't exist before in the show. The entire show exists solely because the United States were bested in a race to the moon and felt compelled enough to get themselves back on top. Yet while the greed for power of being on top and first in the space race brought humanity forwards, the whole Helios storyline shows how greed can also result in humanity hindering itself. Again, it is all about the incremental steps forwards and backwards. There is yet another storyline that pertains to this larger message of the show, and it shall be our last stop. What I am referring to is the storyline of Margo Madison. From the get-go, Margo was the primary reason as to why I watched the show. That may sound odd considering that she is not particularly a likable person, but we are talking about For All Mankind. I am not exactly sure if any of us comes to the show solely to watch people we have a liking to. Her character is quite clear-cut. She is book-smart rather than street-smart. She very much is devoted to her job at NASA and quite literally doesn't appear to have much of a life outside of it. During one interview for a position over at NASA, Margo lays out that she doesn't expect to have children or family.
I give you this job, you're not going to run off on me to start a family, are you?
I don't think kids are in the cards, sir.
She is a mentee of a real-world figure, Werner von Braun. Under a certain light, Werner can be seen as somewhat of a father figure in Margo's life. It is explained that she wasn't as close to her father since he was always consumed by his work. According to the show, he worked on the Manhattan Project. Therefore, in his absence, it can be understood that Werner filled in that gap. He teaches Margo physics, and he helps her along in her NASA endeavors. For what we are about to discuss, these are the basic notions upon which her character seems to be built. The status quo is then upset. It comes out during a congressional hearing that the rockets of Werner's design were built by slave labor in Nazi Germany. Margo questions him whether he knew, and his response is merely this.
Progress is never free, Margo. There's always a cost.
Margo, of course, proceeds to cease any contact with Werner. There is only one instance afterwards during which they meet. Werner points out to her the faults that are holding her back.
So why were you passed over for flight director?
I don't know.
Yes, you do. It is because you do not play the game. You resist forming the social bonds necessary to be seen as a team member, insisting that merit and merit alone is the only important metric for advancement.
According to him, she lacks the social skills to reach her goal of eventually running NASA, and that is the last we see of her mentor. I believe that this is the fundamental idea behind her character. This type of nature is where all of her subsequent actions stem from. If you think about it, she's a scientist through and through. While she learns how to navigate the inner workings of NASA, she is no politician. She thrives in a a world of certainty and mathematics. She works the problem and solves it. What she lacks is real-world acumen, practical experience of what it really is like dealing with other human beings and problems brought in by the variable that is humanity. Within her character arc, this can be seen as both a blessing and a curse. Alongside her storyline in Season 1, we see another storyline develop, that of Alida. She, along with her family, come to the United States as immigrants. Her father gets a job at NASA, and we are shown Alida hanging around the halls of the agency. Margo stumbles upon her working on a math problem and thus begins to mentor Alida. Alida herself has lost her mother, and you can clearly see where exactly the show is headed with this development. Margo would, in a way, serve a maternal role for a child who did not have a mother, quite similarly to how Werner served somewhat of a paternal role in her own life. Season 2 of the show sees the two sides of the space race, the United States and the Soviet Union, come together for a joint Apollo-Soyuz mission in space. During the preparations of the mission, she meets her Soviet counterpart, Sergei. She and him develop a good working relationship throughout the second season. While the two of them are from the opposing sides, they do not exactly treat each other as such. They treat each other as scientists and engineers. There comes a moment when she finds out about a flaw in the Soviet Union vessel that could result in casualties if not fixed. She brings the flaw up with the government, and their advice is to keep quiet. They want to allow their enemies to make a mistake. Margo, on the other hand, goes against those instructions. She goes to Sergei and manages to warn him about the flaw to avert disaster. This is suggestive of a certain blindness that exists within Margo. When she approaches Sergei, she's not approaching the chief engineer of another nation. She's approaching a peer. Her friendship with Sergei develops over the years, and the two of them end up exchanging a lot of information on their respective space programs. Unbeknownst to her, however, Sergei is being controlled by the KGB. The Soviets are forcing him to extract information out of Margo. There also comes a moment where KGB tortures Sergei right in front of her in order to get information out of her, operating under the belief that if she gave what he asked for, she and Sergei would be left alone. She complies. The entire situation can be viewed in a couple of ways. On one hand, this is quite a clear-cut case of treason. Margo willingly handed over some important information to another nation, a country that in no way can really be trusted, a country that the United States has been racing to space for decades. She essentially collaborated with the enemy. On the other hand, it is clear that this is not exactly how Margo sees the situation. Once again, she's an engineer first, above all else. To her, sharing information is a way to advance the space program, and in turn, the whole of mankind. Her blind spots are a blessing, in a sense that she herself believes to be blind to such things as geopolitics when it comes to her work. For her, advancement comes first above all else. And while what she did is clearly treason and goes directly against the interest of her country, the show also presents another edge to the situation. Because from what we are given, it can be argued that her and Sergei's efforts are what sustained the race in the first place. Without the intel of the United States, the Soviets would most likely have fallen back in the race, to the point where the US would come out triumphant. But since they indirectly had Margo on their side, they continue to be a real player in the race. This is quite a charitable view of the situation that ignores certain nuances. As it is mentioned in the show itself, the intel that Margo provides could have had severe adverse effects on the world. The information could also have had military uses that could have been used even against the United States if conditions were sufficient. But while seeing Margo on screen, we mustn't completely be blinded by these noble goals that she may display, because there is plenty of space within her arc where her actions are less than noble. There can be a certain selfishness in her actions. While she and Sergei are both engineers and in a sense co-workers, there is clearly something more that is happening between the two of them. Margo, while previously having shunned all human connections and focusing on work, does find herself connected to Sergei. Their connection is rather touching. Seeing Margo slowly opening up to the idea of being with someone is wholesome. She clearly hasn't explored that side of her life before, but it is exactly this connection that KGB proceeds to exploit. Margo chooses to hand over the intel in order to protect Sergei. She is put in a very unforgiving position, and you could say that the majority of us would probably choose to save the person they love rather than protect the government secrets. Yet it is also exactly this choice that is selfish. While understandable, she still chooses this for him and by extension for herself. In that instance, she isn't driven by some higher ideal to advance, not at all. She puts her own needs and wants above everyone else's. Throughout the third season, Alida, her own mentee, begins catching on that something is off about the Soviet designs. She realizes that Soviets have designs that are strikingly similar to NASA's and thus begins investigating. Numerous times Alida comes to Margo, one of the few people that she trusts, with very concrete evidence that Soviets have copied their designs. But we don't see Margo driven by some higher ideal then. Instead of seeing this as a sign of the universe telling her to confess and come clean, she doesn't make that choice. She doesn't do this out of some noble cause. She does this to only protect herself. In the biggest display of selfishness, she defects right to the enemy. The Soviets offer her to take her in, and she takes it after finding out that her own government is after her. Margo leaves behind Alida without providing any explanations and allows the world to believe that she is dead. Not only that, she then proceeds to pester the Soviet agency as she cannot keep herself away from where all of the action is, thus offering herself up to once again aid another country. Her treason goes as far as to her becoming actively involved in the asteroid mission in season 4. It is actually Margo's own suggestion for her to get out in the open and to reveal herself to the world. Irina Morozova quite directly points out, and rightfully so, Margo's motivation for this suggestion.
I think I should be in charge of Star City's Goldilocks capture operation.
Well, now we reach the truth. You want power. Again. It's like a drug, no?
But you cannot be surprised by this revelation. The show never played coy about what Margo was. Back in the first season, when she was talking with her mentor, he asked her,
What is your goal? Where do you see yourself in 10 years?
In 10 years, I'll be running NASA.
The ambition to get on top, to get ahead was always there. While she certainly contributed greatly to helping humanity advance further into space, she didn't do it only for the sake of humanity. That is just a simple human motivation to get ahead, a certain greed to gain power. And all of this results in Margo sitting at NASA, in an auditorium, just like her mentor did. Now an old woman forced to confront her mentee, just as Werner had to confront her. Margo cannot help but see the parallels between herself and Werner. And while Alida says,
You're not him.
Margo correctly points out,
No, but maybe part of me is.
Because from what is explained or shown, both she and Werner did everything they could to advance their own work, their own agenda. They were unapologetically ambitious in their endeavors. You cannot say that they were some selfless scientists working for the good of everyone. At the end, they really were looking out for themselves, but they did care about advancing humanity forward. These two notions are not mutually exclusive. Yet in her last act of defiance, Margo makes her final play. It is she, along with Alida, that divert the Goldilocks asteroid from NASA's chartered course in order for it to remain in Mars' orbit, ensuring that humanity will not turn away from Mars, and thus, by extension, providing humanity with motivation to advance further into space exploration. While it is Alida who puts in the required command, Margo finally shoulders the blame. While not a perfect redemption for her previous actions, it is still a noble action, finally at last, and all of that is simply humanity unmasked. It is during those first scenes that we can quite quickly piece together a simple notion under which the show operates. It would be a mistake to focus solely on the technology, solely on the space, solely on the exploration. Because the truth of the matter is that it is not technological advancement that gets humanity forward. It is us ourselves that get us forward. Technology is only technology if used by someone. A data set has no significance without context. Advancement is only advancement if viewed through the eyes of the people who are experiencing their current status quo. Equations are merely numbers unless interpreted otherwise by human input. This is what I find myself appreciating the most about the show. It doesn't forget that it is humans that are the main engine behind it all. It may seem as though certain storylines within the show are far removed from what is perceived to be the core of the show, but I would argue that it is those storylines exactly that could make the show all the more compelling. The show displays that humanity is not a monolith. It is composed of various elements that either come along together or clash. It also shows that we as humans are also perfectly capable of disrupting our own progress and getting in the way of ourselves due to the elements that make us human. It also shows that while we see entire institutions working towards a certain goal, those institutions still consist of individuals, and that those individuals and their choices can have massive consequences in the flow of history. Even the more controversial storylines within the show can be viewed through this lens. And however much one would like to argue that certain storylines are too far-fetched, you can still see that they were born out of an idea that ties the show together. Humanity's journey into the stars is as complex as humanity itself. It is a complex equilibrium of various forces working forwards and backwards. I suppose that is one thing that I can absolutely compliment the show on. 4 seasons in, it didn't really lose this particular controlling idea behind some of these storylines. But we also cannot be blinded by these larger ideas presented in the show, especially since the current approach also produces its own share of problems.
For All Mankind is a show that is quite unique, but it is unique not only in its premise. A common problem within shows that experience a decline or a downfall is that after a certain moment they lose their purpose and identity. At a particular point, it usually becomes apparent that whoever is in charge no longer has a plan at hand to steer the narrative forward in a cohesive and coherent manner. Shows suddenly depart from what made them good in the first place in order to needlessly extend their life. Yet it is quite clear that this may not be the problem with For All Mankind. I don't believe it is particularly difficult to have a broad stroke plan for a show like this. The solar system is quite limited, just as humans are in their capabilities to explore it. A simple look at Wikipedia and a few references can quite clearly establish an understanding which stops within the journey into space are the most feasible. Losing its purpose is certainly not the show's issue. I would wager, however, that it is at least part of the equation to understand why For All Mankind is the way it is. What if having very particular ideas in mind is exactly what is holding the show back? This would be quite a charitable opinion on my behalf, and I hold this opinion because I don't think the show is as stupid as it can sometimes appear. Clearly a lot of thought has gone into it, and it might be too optimistic of me, as it would be way easier to say that the show is simply not as smart as it thinks it is. Certain choices do indicate that there is a tunnel vision that strikes once in a while. I believe this can be sensed across various facets within the show. From what sort of trajectory the show charts ahead, to how they handle the divergence, to what type of equilibrium they attempt to display. For All Mankind is three things at once. It is a science fiction, it is an alternate history, as well as a drama. The three strands inform each other in interesting ways and serve their purposes. Alternate history route is there to provide a basis for this entire scenario. It is the genesis of the entire show. Science fiction, closely related to alternative history, is there to provide the science basis for the scenario, and the drama is there to carry a certain drive. The relationship between these notions should have remained in that exact order. What if informing the science fiction, and the science fiction informing the drama. These three labels are and should be intrinsically linked. We already discussed at length that this order of things was broken first in season 2. The drama aspect of it began to come first. Or did it? I've thrown a lot of stones at other seasons, yet season 1 is the one that I have constantly praised. Mayhaps it is time to also reflect a tad more on season 1. While most of it works as it should, there is one strand of it that does not. The storyline of Elida Rosales, one might argue, serves no particular role in the space race depicted in season 1. It exists just like the storylines of Karen and Danny in season 2, in somewhat of an isolation. It does not have a direct effect on the program, that is true, but from where the show's trajectory is concerned, it was quite obvious that she was being set up for something down the line. It does indicate a forethought within the show. It raises a question: did the show always plan on panning out the way it did? Having seen season 4, we already know what her partial purpose was, to help bring Margo's storyline full circle. So perhaps I am ascribing too much credit to the first season. The show certainly thinks ahead, seasons and seasons ahead in fact, but perhaps those plans are exactly what keeps them away from achieving greatness. As I have already mentioned, the show, as it turns out, becomes more concerned about where the characters end up rather than humanity as a whole. But having a set point to which you have to arrive can seriously harm the flow of a narrative if it is being kept to way too hard. Margo's storyline, while having some minor hiccups here and there, works actually well because it was planned out. But then we have storylines such as that of Kelly. While I criticize her heavily, the show did not. And why is that? Because criticizing a character for that would mean having actual consequences. And having actual consequences would mean having to hold Kelly accountable and be potentially barred from any further missions. But we cannot have that, now can we? Because that would mean that she might not be able to be the one to discover life later down the line. And we also want to have our Mars baby, so terminating the pregnancy mustn't even be an option. The show absolutely has to view this event as cute and amazing, because you can sense that they have a storyline in store down the line for the first Martian child. Same can be seen with her father at Baldwin. Making him face consequences for his actions on an institutional level would mean holding him accountable and potentially barring him from subsequent missions. But we do not want that, now do we? Because we want him to have his little old man arc on Mars in season 4. Same can be observed with Gordo and Tracy. Gordo should not have been up there, but he was there. And why is that? Because we had to have his little arc with Tracy and for the two of them to have this huge sacrifice moment at the end of season 2. This is a huge reason as to why I keep insisting for the show to not be precious about its characters, because that is where its problems come. It becomes too obsessed with reaching those specific character arcs that it begins losing quality. And of what good is a character arc if it is not of any quality? It is an ironic way way to approach character writing in a show called For All Mankind. Science fiction in general usually leans on more grim implications rather than optimistic ones. It informs its consumers and usually warns. For All Mankind sets itself apart from this trend. It chooses a lens of optimism rather than pessimism. It has a lot of faith in humanity, but one must question, of what worth is that faith? There is a thin line between optimism and foolishness, and For All Mankind crosses that line on multiple occasions. Even going back to the example of Kelly's pregnancy, the people choosing to sacrifice their own comfort for Kelly could be seen as a moment of unity and sacrifice among humankind. But that sacrifice comes without any second thought, and that is simply foolish. If there was a process of consideration and then people came together to unite and rally behind Kelly, that would be optimism and humanity prevailing. But this circumvention of additional nuance does not display humanity properly. The show tries to say that humanity is messy, but it has conditions for that. It is only messy when the plot demands it, not when it actually should be messy. When Ed does not face proper consequence, it is simply not an accurate portrayal of humanity. If the show displayed a process where he was going to, but that consequence was shot down within NASA or Helios because someone was pulling strings, that would be accurate. The show can try and present whatever notions it has about humanity, but those notions lose all their meaning as soon as the show neglects to show any nuance or weight in it. That is when the show becomes foolish. Humanity, even if you have an optimistic outlook, is still full of nuance and consequence. It is yet another irony hidden within. By eliminating that nuance, you also eliminate consequence. The show focusing on specific characters would suggest that they are the most consequential, which is a direct contradiction of some of the approaches that we have already seen on the show. Because once more, the consequences from character actions are conditional. The show is very selective in which consequences the actions of characters generate. Even with Karen and the whole ordeal with the space hotel, an accident like that would generate a lot of consequences, yet the show sidesteps all of that nuance, both on her character level and on a broader level concerning space exploration. It would at the very least be an insane PR nightmare. We only get the hotel to become a vehicle to Helios, but nothing else comes out of that. Within some of these storylines there are always asterisks, always some invisible strings that dictate how things should be, because we have to hit a certain character beat in a certain amount of time. There is a pattern within the show that is fascinating from this point of view. The finales usually hit the best, because they probably have these finales in mind, as they should, and then they have to scramble their way towards them and do that by whatever means necessary. In a way, they are smashing their way through the narrative to hit specific points because they are too beholden to a specific vision. Not only is it visible within equilibrium or trajectory, it is also visible within the divergence from our timeline. As discussed, the show takes these events and forces them in such a way to get the outcome that they want, even if it does not particularly make sense. It is an extreme opposite of the usual problems within shows, which is a lack of planning. This is a very lifeless and inorganic approach. What we end up with is a science fiction side that is not that well developed, since it does not speculate properly, an alternate history that keeps clashing into our timeline and thus becomes less imaginative, and it cannot be more imaginative or well developed because the drama side has its own rules that it imposes on the rest of the narrative, yet the drama becomes cheap because it bends reality and uses contrivances to move along. It sometimes feels as though none of these three components work properly together at any given time. At least one of them is sacrificed constantly. It may not be a complete downfall. Certain parts of the show are still quite great, but it is still a noticeable decline. Perhaps the further seasons will reach new heights never experienced before and prove me wrong. Yet, I believe it is quite clear that For All Mankind is a show that has and is facing a decline.